Díomh gach déine agus fáilte go dtí a codomh brethbh is mise cuimhín ó Flanagan. Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to the Brehon Academy. I'm Kevin Flanagan. Last week, we heard part one of Irish wisdom preserved in the Bible and the pyramids. And I know it's an out there topic, okay? I know it's an out there topic. But the reason why I'm showing this to you and playing this for you is because this idea of Ireland connected to Egypt, it potentially runs even deeper than we previously thought. If any of you are familiar with Michael Tessarien's work, you're going to know what I'm talking about here. And this author, Conor MacDari, he was somebody who inspired Michael Tessarien to write those books. He's heavily cited in the Irish Origins of Civilization series. In last week's episode, we were hearing very bold claims about Irish culture and Irish society being the true Christian church, the Church of IESA. In this next episode, we're going to go deeper into that concept. We're going to go deeper into the concepts of the Sphinx, the pyramids, there's a few pyramids that are mentioned in the last couple of chapters. I'd like to thank Darrell T. Smith II again. Here's his YouTube channel. Here's his second YouTube channel. And here is his Spotify. Please go and show him your support. Tell him thank you if you're grateful for the recording that he graciously allowed us to play on the Brehon Academy. Stick with this till the end, because I'm sure by the end of this, if you've not heard of these concepts before, you will never be able to think about Ireland in the same way ever again. Okay. Oh, please check out my website, brehonacademy.org. We have many articles over there. We have online courses and we have a merch shop. Okay. And I'm also over on I'm on every social media. Well, not every. When I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on X. You can search for Brehon Academy, but I'm also going to put the links in the description and probably the top comment, the top pinned comment. So with all that being said, I think you've heard me blabbing on enough. Let's get into the video.
Irish Wisdom Preserved in Bible and Pyramids by Conor MacDari, published 1923. Chapter 7. Coming of St. Patrick to Ireland. The story of the coming to Ireland of St. Patrick is an invention concocted by the English priests of the Romish Church under the leadership of William, Bishop of Malmesbury, who was a dominant personality and well skilled in the arts of trickery of Roman priestcraft and policy. He has been credited with his associates as the inventive genius who constructed this purely fictitious, absurd, and mythical story of the conversion of the Irish by St. Patrick. St. Patrick is a bogus personage set up to deceive the Irish Catholics. The English high churchmen of today are so conscious of it, and the writer of the article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, 9th edition, page 248, seems to be very much concerned lest he fail to make the bogus saint appear real in order to keep up the deception. He says, quote, "Our knowledge of the Irish apostle is, however, so contradictory and unsatisfactory that no reliance can be placed on any dates connected with him. In any case, when we remember the time and the state of Europe, it is not at all likely that the place of Palladius could be so rapidly supplied as the above date." 431 A.D. is the date referred to, and Patrick is supposed to be on the scene the next year following. While there are many lives of the saint, these are rather legendary than historical biographies, but although there is much obscurity and confusion in the acts of St. Patrick, there cannot be the slightest doubt of his real existence. End quote. This invention of the character of St. Patrick is consistent with others of which the English Roman priests have been the authors. A fictitious story has been woven about his name to deceive the Irish, to show falsely the conversion of Ireland, and to establish the fact that this conversion was brought about in the day and age claimed, and that it was done, quote, peaceably without the shedding of blood, end quote, as the modern Irish are made to believe. The Irish Roman Catholic priests have ever since kept up this deception. It seems to be a part of the secret understanding between the priesthoods of Britain and Rome. The history of the saint, or the dates of any of the occurrences mentioned therein, did not need to be very exact, for those plotters held that the more exactly and definite the dates were fixed, the more it would give the story the appearance of having been arranged, and the easier it would be to contradict it. So we see that the dates were not too arbitrarily fixed, nor was even the place of his birth very definitely settled. The English writers claim that he was born in Scotland. The Irish Roman Catholic writers claim that he was born in France. The Irish Roman Catholic priests encourage the belief in the latter place, as if desiring the removal of the birthplace of the so-called saint to a land as far as possible of his inception or invention. A priest-ridden people are not in the habit of questioning the facts put before them by those whose authority they consider absolute. Suspicion has never been awakened in them regarding the facts or the deception practiced upon them. St. Patrick is a fictitious creation from the brain of the English bishop and is based on a myth. The fiction was designed to deceive the latter-day Irish, which it has surely done, and others as well. It is a very simple myth when explained. The idea of the St. Patrick myth is very plain. The fiction of the finding of the three bodies of Patrick, Bridget, and 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀 in one grave, which is an aspect of this myth, is a symbolical of the triad of the human personality of spirit, soul, and body. 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀 is the spirit, Bridget is the soul, for the soul is said to be feminine, and Patrick is the body or personal man. The body has ever been said to be the grave of the spirit. The inventors of this myth had this idea before them in constructing the story, and hence the fiction of the discovery of the three bodies in one grave. This invented story has been doing duty as history for quite a period of time. It is one of the most important deceits which the British priests have imposed on the world. It has deceived Catholics and Protestants alike. Another aspect of the myth, like many other religious myths, is that it is based on the Holy Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Be it remembered that Patrick, Bridget, and 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀 are associated. As the higher triad, 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀 represents the father-son or male principle. Bridget represents the mother principle of deity, the soul, and Patrick represents the son. Therefore, he is said to be a patrician, one born of noble lineage, as Jesus, the Son, is said to be born of the kingly house of David, and is also a patrician. This is the first time since it was invented, as far as we know, that this myth has been revealed or explained and given out to the public. In the story of the mythical saint, he is made to accomplish his mission of converting Ireland to Romanism in a most expeditious fashion, peaceably without shedding of a drop of blood, in the short period of his lifetime. This is absurd in the face of the fact that, in order to preserve her church and papacy, Ireland was engaged in a struggle with Rome for more than 1,000 years. In the story of St. Patrick's life, they make a very quick matter of this conversion, and even have him perform miracles. They carry this to the ridiculous extent of having him go out into the fields at the request of his sister to gather up some wood for the fire. It happened that it was in the winter season, and the ground was covered with snow and ice. Finding no wood, he simply gathered up an armful of icicles and brought them to the house, where he converted them into faggots for her to put on the fire. Other equally preposterous performances are credited to him. This all serves to show how gullible a people may become through ignorance, superstition, and priestcraft, and proves anew how truthful are the words ascribed to Lactantius. Quote, "Among those who seek power and gain from their religion, there will never be wanting an inclination to forge and lie for it." End quote. The Roman Church Fathers had a most compelling reason in practicing concealment, and for that purpose they've tried to destroy all authentic history and to blot out all true accounts of the past records of mankind. They made claim that theirs was a new and original divine religion, which they declared a specially born Savior and Son of the great God of heaven had come to reveal for the purpose of delivering the earth from sin. They assert that he gave this message to 12 poor men who were his apostles. The name of this Savior they called Jesus, and said that he was put to death on a cross, that he had selected Peter as the head of those 12 men, who, with 70 disciples, formed the new Christian church. This story is an invention based on and contained in the allegory of the sun god IESA and the descent of spirit into the body or man. This was all taken from the original Irish version of that story and was made known to the whole world long before it was adopted at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 AD, when the Christian church is said to have been born. The Irish religion of IESA was the parent religion or church which had prevailed in the countries along the Mediterranean Sea and on the American continent for thousands of years. IESA, Hesiod, and 𝗃𝗵𝗵𝗀 are different forms of spelling the first and second names of this ancient savior, invented and constructed as a myth by the adept Irish priests, to be worshipped by the multitude, the esoteric or secret truths of which were reserved for the priesthood itself. In some cities or localities, the deity was worshipped under special names, as in Greece, the name Ies was transformed into Zeus. Thus, the Greeks got their chief god, derived from the Irish sun god, though its derivation has not been acknowledged by those priests who are aware of the fact. Though some of these priests chafe under the deception, they remain silent and allow the great motherland of sacerdotal wisdom to be defrauded and denied the credit and honor which is her due. Some would have us believe that the Hindus gave Zeus to the Greeks, that the word is derived from the Sanskrit dias, meaning bright sky. This is not so, for the very reason that the Hindus themselves got their Sanskrit and their first deities from the same Aryan priesthood as the Greeks did. Dias is not the chief god of the Hindus, while Zeus is the chief of the Greek gods. Ies is the ruling spirit or god of the sun, and he not only makes the sky bright, but is the chief ruler of our system and the Lord of the heavens. Aside from the relative distinction ascribed to each, they are both derived from and are a modification of Ies, thus Deus or Dias, and so Zeus. It is by just such a slight changes or modifications in names that the Roman doctors have formulated the apostle St. Paul, who is but a personification of the spirit in the body, or the disciple of the sun god, after the manner of the Irish church, but not declared to be such. The name Paul is derived from the Irish root word bel, a name for the sun. This name changes from Bel to Beol, as in Beol Tina, meaning Bel's fire. It becomes Baal, also Ibalis from this form. In time, it becomes Apollo, the sun god. And by abbreviating this name to Paul, P-O-L, they formulated St. Paul, and made of him an oracle under the new dispensation. It was this Irish sun god that was adopted by the Roman Church at the Council of Nicaea. At this council, representatives from all parts of the Roman Empire are said to have met at the command of the Emperor Constantine to formulate a church policy and unified creed and form of worship which would bring all of the people under one spiritual head. The adoption of such measures would at once increase the power of the church, as well as ensure the devotion and veneration of the populace for the person of the emperor, to whom they attributed divine power. The consummation of this policy was expected to be of great benefit to both church and state. and enable the emperor to weld the various peoples of the different countries which comprise the empire into a unified whole. The savior, IESA, previous to this time, was worshipped in all of the countries in the western part of the empire, where he had been preached by the priests of the Irish Church of IESA for many centuries before. As the worship of the people centered around this savior, IESA, the sun god, he was not abolished or denied to the people, but was appropriated by Rome, and the name was Latinized to Jesu, where Latin superseded the Celtic language, and has been anglicized as Jesus. It is the history of IESA that the Old Testament myths have preserved for us. Under the name of Jesu, we are told that he is a different personage, and an allegorical New Testament on the lines of the Old is supposed to represent him in his disguised form. These books are but two versions of the same theme. One is a complement, disguised, of the other. So Rome did not give us a new savior. She adopted a new policy and gave us only deceit. She has not even given us a new truth. Her claim is refuted by the words of St. Augustine, one of her own oracles. He says, quote, "The truths of religion existed from aforetime, and were not absent from among men, but from the time of the coming of Christ have been called Christian." End quote. From the time of the coming of Christ means only since the success of Rome in destroying the early church and fixing a date and location for the ideal Savior's birthplace. By the suppression of the facts herein stated, it has been easy for churchmen to preach to people of a modern day and age that Jesus was a new and original Savior, with a birthplace and history as they describe and set forth. This history, I repeat, is borrowed from the mythic story of the Irish sun god IESA. Has the reader a doubt of it? Jesus is said to have been born in Bethlehem, the house of the day. The Irish word for house is both. La means day in Irish, and as Hebrew is but a jargon of Irish, the fraud becomes as plain as, quote, day, end quote. The name Christ is added to Jesus and is meant as a title, which is to indicate that spiritual perfection or the messianic state has been attained. The name complete is taken from the ancient religion of IESA, and both words of the name have the same meaning. So, 𝗃 is the name in full of the Irish Savior, adopted at the Council of Nice, and every Irishman who today speaks the Irish language, when speaking the name of Jesus Christ in his native tongue, pronounces it 𝗃, unconscious of the fact that this was the Savior on the cross, worshipped by his forefathers for ages, even before Rome was founded on her 7 hills. In fact, and in truth, it was the Irish who founded Rome itself. It was anciently an Irish colony and church establishment, founded by the Phoenicians, Irish, and spelled with an F, for both trading and religious purposes, and they gave to it its name, as has been shown by the etymology of the word Rome. Suffice to say that Rome had a most urgent reason for bringing about the Dark Ages and plunging the world into ignorance. This she accomplished by denying education to the people, which policy she carried out to such an extent that in time it reacted upon herself. For later, the youths who were recruited from among the people to fill the ranks of the priesthood were unable to read or write. When they had occasion to sign documents or papers, they did so by making a mark, thus X, after their names. These priests were known as marksmen. Only those who were especially favored were able to read and write. From the 11th to the 14th century, Rome devoted her efforts to having fictitious histories written of the different countries, and endeavored to make all of those histories correspond with each other. In this way, the priest scribes figured that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to discover how Rome obtained her Savior, her Bible, and her religious institutions. In order to break off all connections with the past, they decided to change the names of the different countries so that no continued and unbroken account of the affairs of those countries would be known to us. This was all in accordance with the priestly axiom that at the end of an age, when the old religion is overthrown and a new one set up, all trace and memory of the past is blotted out. Thus has Ireland's church and history been submerged by Rome and Britain. And as if to commemorate and preserve this fact in mythic form, they conferred a name of the island, Erin, upon a daughter of Zeus. Erin or Pax, or the peace which succeeds a military campaign. From Heathen Religion by Reverend John B. Goss, page 326. It was a somewhat lengthy campaign of murder, outrage, and bloodshed, to be sure, and by this name the English and Roman priests are reminded of it. New names were given to places so that posterity might not be able to find any clue or evidence with which they might be able to refute any claim or fiction which the Roman priesthood might at any time proclaim as a divine truth. In short, their aim was to leave nothing extant that would serve in any way to lessen, in the minds of the ignorant multitude, the claim of the fictitious Roman Pope to spiritual overlordship and to be the divine oracle of the deity, and the claim of the priest to be the mediator between God and man. Every man must be his own priest before God. There can be no other, for every man must be his own Savior through his own Holy Spirit within himself. The Almighty God alone forgives sin, and the only mediator or intercessor that man needs, or, for that matter, can have, is his own Holy Spirit, or IESA, which dwells within himself, if man merits his higher spirit. No priest can obtrude himself as a third person. It is only presumption on his part to make a pretense of doing so. As with everyone else, he has hard enough task to save himself, that is, to reach final perfection. The institution of confession is of ancient practice and is older than Rome. It is based on the conception of the idea held by the Irish priests of the sun, that as the sun god saw and heard all things, he knew all things. He was charitable, merciful, and forgiving to all who were contrite and strove to live a better life. As the sun god could forgive all sin, his priest could also do the same, the assumption being that the disciple has received this power from his master. But this by no means follows. The practice of this idea served as a discipline among the priests and neophytes, and was a potent means in keeping the multitude or laity in subjection to the rule of the priests. It is at variance with modern enlightened ideas as a means to spiritual well-being. Chapter 8. Rome and the Pagans. Once the Council of Nicaea had terminated its labors in agreement as to the policy and title of the new Christian Church, if entirely new it can be called, and the adoption of the Savior IESA or Jesu, the civil powers of the state, incited by the priests, began a most rigorous campaign for compelling the people to embrace the new religion. Those who obstinately refused to accept it were put to death, and of those who escaped death many fled to remote places, while others were banished from their homes. Terrible persecutions prevailed in all the important centers, where priests were active in making proselytes, and it was in the large cities and towns where the new church made its earliest and most rapid gains in numbers, for there the civil powers were strongest and most in evidence. In the rural districts, the people were not so immediately under the control of the police power of the government and the priests, and so were not as easily coerced into joining the Roman state church. They resisted to such an extent that they were held up to the city and townspeople by the priests as objects of scorn, and were called pagans, from pagi, meaning country or rural people. This is where and how we got our pagans of history. the people living in the country districts who refused to be forced into the acceptance of the new creed at the behest of the new political priesthood. The latter had the force of the civil power at their command and were most unmerciful in their use of it. The method employed by Constantine in forcing the people to accept the state church is thus set forth. Quote, "The emperor issued the most severe edicts against those who were opposed to the new church. At the same time, he conferred dignities and rewards upon those who professed Christianity, and, instigated by the clergy whose interest and livelihood were in the success of the new organization, carried his compulsory proselytizing to such an extent that, along with murder and other cruelties inflicted upon the people, which did not bring the speedy results he expected, he put them to the sword, flame, and torture, which did bring results. In addition to these methods, he offered bribes to the people to embrace the new creed. He heaped honors and favors upon the habitues of his court, who most naturally were the first to agree with his wishes, and upon those who were in the civil and military employments of the government. He figured on the common people to follow the example of those of higher station. He gave freedom to the slaves, and to those in the ordinary walks of life he gave clothing and bribed them with gold, and it is said that in a very short time many thousands of the people joined the church. With the help of the priests, he left no means untried that would further the establishment of the new order and the suppression of the old. He issued edicts forbidding all others to assemble or to hold meetings, and passed laws that any buildings used by them should be destroyed, and according to Eusebius, in that way all those who held to doctrines and opinions contrary to the new church were suppressed. Scholars and philosophers were silenced or banished, and their works, all that could be found of them, were thrown to the flames. The Emperor Theodosius persecuted with even greater severity, and all writings, wherever they could be found, that did not support or were against the new religion were destroyed. And this ambitious hypocrite, this guilty wretch, under the pretense of piety, declared that he could not allow so much to come to men's ears, which tended to provoke God to wrath and offend the minds of the pious. The Emperor Theodosius proved himself a fitting instrument for the new Roman project, as evidenced by the acts of his cruel reign. He displayed a vicious zeal in persecuting all those who refused to accept the new faith, which he was determined to make the dominant and sole religion of the empire, thereby making the emperor the complete ruling autocrat of the very souls as well as of the bodies of the people." End quote. From Bible Myths by T.W. Doane. So, the religion which these Roman despots committed so many crimes to establish should not be called Christianity, but Romanism or emperorism, in other words, popery, for the head of the Roman state aimed to be not only emperor but also Pope Universal, as soon as the Irish Pope, whose seat was at Tara, could be dethroned. This idea had its birth in the minds of the Roman hierarchy of an earlier day, and with the success of Roman arms and the growth of the state, the old religion was made over and imposed on the people under a new name. They wanted a national or Roman religion of their own, so from the old they adapted one designed to give them better control over the multitude and still be called Christianity. The churchmen, Protestants as well as Catholics, conceal the motive which was behind the new movement and its false claims. Of course, the multitude of our people are not acquainted with the facts, but I am satisfied that the churchmen, who are thinkers and philosophers, know them well. An apologist for Rome says, in Encyclopaedia Britannica, page 227, volume 8, 9th edition, article England, quote, "Christianity is historically the religion of the Roman Empire. Wherever the influence of Rome, east or west, has spread, there Christianity has been dominant. Beyond that range it has taken little root." End quote. Just so, and as the Roman standard was never planted on Irish soil and the Roman sword never reached Ireland, so the Roman church power never reached there, and it was not until a later date, in the 12th century, that at the behest of Rome the English invaders brought it there, with its usual priestly accompaniment of fire, sword, and pillage. Not until then was Erin's resplendent light extinguished, her papacy stolen, and her spiritual sun set into the night of oblivion. Christianity did not originate in Rome or in any part of the Roman dominions. It is only a false and fictitious assumption to ascribe the beginnings or origin of the Christian religion to Rome. The period of time which the above-quoted writer refers to and would have us consider as historical is a mere 1600 years, that is, from the time of the Council of Nice in 325 AD, when Rome formally adopted it, until the present time. But the real and true facts of Christianity say that it was the religion of ancient Ireland for thousands of years previous to this date. This was at a time when Rome was but a colony of the Irish Church, the same as the rest of the Mediterranean Church colonies or settlements, such as Syracuse in Sicily, taking its name from Soricus, the Easterner or sun, which were established there by the Irish Phoenicians, spelled with an F, meaning sun worshippers. This fact is cryptically preserved in the mythic legend of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers. Romulus is said to have founded Rome, and from him Rome is said to take its name. Romulus and Remus are but two formulated or concocted names of the sun. Romulus, read backwards, is Sulumor, Solus Mor, the great light, the sun, and Remus, read backwards, is Sum Air, summer, as it was meant to be. Summer is a mythic ideal, name of and a true aspect of the sun. These names are taken from the Irish, in fact, as well as in ideal. One of the Irish names of the sun is Somb, Sovra, summer. It is from this Celtic root word that we get our Anglo-Saxon word summer. The mother of these twins was the virgin Rhea Silvia, the moon. In the myth, the moon is sometimes the spouse and sometimes the mother of the sun. These twins are nursed by a wolf, the church, as one of the Irish ideal titles of the sun was the wolf. The priests of the ancient church were called the children or brethren of the heavenly wolf. On earth, the church was mythically his spouse. Hence, the church nursed or cared for her priests or children who founded the church colony of Rome. All this at a time before Rome grew strong enough to enter on her career of conquest. As she advanced in growth and power, her success made her ambitious. To possess the Irish papacy and spiritual sovereignty was the motive in all the Western wars of the Roman Empire. Those wars were caused by the lust of the Roman Church for power and wealth, for neither then nor since have its professions and practice corresponded. While it is proclaimed as its founder, Jesus, the exemplar of peace on earth, goodwill to men, its history reeks with the blood of millions of human beings, victims or dupes who were recruited and sacrificed in projects designed to swell the power of that organization. Under pretensions of virtue and zeal for God, the blackest of lust of power and gain, her history is foul with crime. She counts on time to have it forgotten, and believes that historians will do the rest. They are capable of making some very erroneous statements for concealment. I have heard an Irish Roman Catholic priest make the statement, in a lecture on Egypt, that the Mohammedans burned the Library of Alexandria in the year 700 AD. He did but skip 300 years in making that statement. If the truth be known, there was no library in Alexandria at that date to be destroyed. Who could believe that so intolerant and wicked a body as the Roman Church would allow a library to exist in the year 700, in an age when they were putting to death everyone known to have advanced ideas or knowledge? Hypatia, the scholar and philosopher, was put to death in the year 414 by St. Cyril and his mob, many of whom were monks. She was spreading light and knowledge and stood in the way of Bishop Cyril and the reign of ignorance, which was inaugurated by the so-called Fathers. She was seized on the steps of the academy where she delivered her lectures, stripped naked on the street, dragged into a Roman church, and put to death, her body being burned. For more than 1,000 years thereafter, it was more than anyone's life was worth to have it known that one could think for oneself. It was a long cry from Hypatia to John Huss and Galileo and the victims of the Spanish Inquisition. The Roman Church policy did not tolerate or encourage libraries any more than it tolerated the Irish Church of IESA. A church that is spreading ignorance and suppressing knowledge is not suffering libraries to exist. This priest would falsify in order to remove the blame from his own church and place it upon another. His church committed this crime under the leadership of the zealot Saint Cyril, Bishop of Alexandria, in or about the year 400. The following excerpt, taken from the writings attributed to a St. Augustine, will show how much reliability can be placed upon what they have written for us. Augustine is said to be one of the greatest of the Church Fathers. He says, quote, I was already Bishop of Hippo when I went into Ethiopia with some servants of Christ there to preach the gospel. In this country we saw many men and women without heads, who had 2 great eyes in their breasts, and in countries still more southerly we saw people who had but 1 eye in their foreheads. End quote. Quoted in Taylor's Syntagma, page 52, found in Bible Myths, page 437. A people for whom such things were written must have been grossly ignorant or reduced to a juvenile state of mind. In our day, children 10 years old would refuse to believe such stories. I have quoted this to give an idea of the mental soil in which Romanism developed and can best flourish, and this is a sample of what one of the greatest fathers of the Church wrote. This statement of Augustine's is pure falsehood, but no more so than the story given out by those same fathers as to the real source whence they obtained Jesus and the Bible, the story by which they have deceived the entire Christian world, saying that they came of the Hebrew race, a race which never existed and which was but a priestly cult or order of the early Christians of the ancient sun worship of the Irish religion of IESA. Chapter IX. The Fiction in Roman History. It has been said that the history of ancient Rome is mostly fiction. This observation is very true, but in the absence of any special effort to expose these fictions, they have persisted through the efforts of modern churchmen and have been embodied in the history textbooks of the schools. These invented stories of events are still taught as genuine facts. This fiction is not due to our authors having merely a misunderstanding of the past, or but a partial knowledge of the events of those remote periods, but it is the result of a studied propaganda which has been carried on by Rome and Britain for centuries. The operation of this propaganda has been continued in full force because the ruling spirits of the Roman and English church hierarchies are as alive to the fact and as conscious today of the fraud perpetrated on the world, resulting in the overthrow of the Irish Church and the false story of the Irish Bible and Savior, as they were at the time the fraud was first enacted. As Rome and Britain together brought about this state of affairs, they both have ever since endeavored to keep in circulation the false and absurd tales which they invented and presented to us as history. In fact, our history of Rome has come from the English hierarchy and was composed to harmonize with this idea. The internal evidence alone is sufficient to prove this, even though other evidence, no matter how wide the rift has become in politics and religion between England and Rome since the perpetration of this great crime, their joint guilt and the fear of the consequences of exposure have been the impelling motives for maintaining secrecy. The very life and existence of the English and Roman churches depended upon a truce regarding this matter. The English church prides itself as being the eldest daughter of the Roman church, and therefore an apostolic church, a claim which is as false as that of Rome itself. Both Peter and Paul, as well as the rest of the so-called apostles, are but ideas personified. They never existed as human beings and are but invented characters. The lesson taught by the manner in which the mother church, Rome, acquired the papacy was not lost on the daughter, for in due course of time and with the development of events, the idea was born in the minds of the English hierarchy that someday the English church would displace the Roman, and appropriate the papacy for itself and become the ruling church of the world. Is not this the real reason why King Henry VIII was proclaimed head or pope of the English Church? They were conscious of the fact that it was by force of English arms that Rome got the papacy, and they thought that the time at hand for them to reach out for it. Rome had to them as a model. It was a time when England was deeply conscious of her position and importance, and the idea was held that England was destined to be the logical successor of the Roman Empire as a world power. To this day, she has not relinquished that idea. It is an ideal which she is secretly and steadily pursuing. The English state has persisted in its endeavors to extend its dominions with the idea of dominating the world. The papacy was to be an aid to that end. They knew how Rome acquired it, for they had reduced and plundered Ireland in order to confer it upon her. Now they thought the time auspicious to appropriate it as an appendage and aid to the English crown. But this ambition was destined not to be realized. The course of events has kept the papacy at Rome. However, the British state has persevered in its efforts to extend its empire to this very day. In England, church and state work hand in hand, and my Lord Bishop still sits in the House of Lords participating in the acts of vicious government as evidenced by the recent happenings in Ireland. A certain bishop in the upper branch of Parliament defended the killing by government forces, whose deeds, said to be justified as reprisals, have been denounced by an outspoken portion of the British press as a disgrace to civilized government. The propaganda of British church and state is carried on in our own country. It is very evident in the tone of our leading newspapers. In our school histories, it is carried on in one of its phases, in the guise of fabulous events which are presented as real occurrences in the history not only of England, but also of Rome. The same can be said of the history of Greece, for the authorship is the same, and for the same purpose of deception. It is not within the scope of this work to do more than give a few succinct examples. In writing their histories of Rome and Greece, the church scribes had no intention of confining themselves to the narrative of actual facts which did happen or might have happened in the material and political development of those two countries. If they had really wished to write an accurate history of those countries at the late day in which they were composed, it would have been almost impossible to have done so, for in the beginning of a certain period which those histories treat of, and for centuries later, the Roman Church was engaged in the destruction of libraries and records rather than in preserving them. All the histories written by the priests and the monks were falsely colored and intentionally fictitious. They were written to convey a secret meaning to the chosen ones. Were it not for the facts presented in these pages, it would be difficult to reconcile the action of the Church in destroying all literature and records in one age, and at a later period, manifesting such zeal in endeavors to encourage the production of literature and quote-unquote histories, and the establishment of schools in which to give instruction in those histories. Those histories were written for purposes of propaganda, which is still being carried on. The English invasion of Ireland at the behest of Rome, the suppression of the Irish papacy and Church of IESA, with the appropriation of its Bible and Savior, and the false statements made by Rome as to the Savior's birthplace and earthly career, made it absolutely necessary for church writers to produce histories which would either substantiate the fact or make it very plausible or difficult to refute. So, therefore, they have given us an ingenious account of the past ages and blended in the fictitious stories of the birth of Jesus and how we came to have the Bible. In writing their histories, they have invented and introduced such facts as were suitable to contain certain hidden ideas and at the same time serve as a history for the multitude. Along these lines, they proceeded to reconstruct history. After the plan was thought out, the absence of real facts presented no difficulty to the writers. They invented the facts which would best serve the purpose they had in mind. These facts conform to certain mental conceptions of the writers and represent aspects of man's physical or spiritual nature, or both as the case may be. The interpretation of the historian Buckle will explain the philosophy and lines upon which the priests of Rome and Britain built up their histories. He says, quote, "The real history of the human race is the history of tendencies which are perceived by the mind, and not of events which are discovered by the senses." End quote. Either through instruction or by intuitive penetration, Buckle became aware of the process or lines along which our histories have been written. Let us consider the mythical personage Julius Caesar, who has been introduced into Roman history by the priests in order to glorify Rome with great characters. While at first they endow him with the qualities that make him very human, they finally elevate him to the magnitude of a demigod and, at death, deify him. As a hero leading the Roman legions, he represents, like Hercules, the sun god. When he crosses the Rubicon to make himself master of Rome and seize the crown, his character changes. Here he represents the spirit or human ego of man being born into the flesh and taking possession of the body. One of the definitions of the word Rome is body, and the Rubicon, ruby or red, represents the blood in the body. This illustrates the priestly ideals on which false history has been written. This also explains why they say that the month of July was named after Julius. It was named for him, but long ages before he became a Latin hero. The name of the month of July is taken from the Irish name of that month, which is Iúil, there being no J in the Irish alphabet. The word Iúil represents the sun in his aspect of power at that period. As the Latin is a daughter of the Celtic, the British priest scribes borrowed the name and created a new Roman hero and demigod, Julius Caesar. Forging history was a practice with which the British hierarchy had long been familiar. At a later date, with the assistance of Irish monks and scholiasts, they wrote the works which were attributed to one William Shakespeare, for the same purpose of creating for England what they had already done for Rome, namely, to give her an illustrious son, a transcendent genius for emulation and admiration of future generations. Critics have noted the form of expression and language used by Shakespeare, peculiar to the English spoken in Ireland rather than that which was spoken at the time in England, without drawing the inference that those works, or some of them, were written by Irishmen. They were merely struck by the peculiarity of the words brogue used in Ireland and were in no wise suspicious or aware of the purpose of the hierarchy. They did not connect the monks and scholiasts with the works. The works bear strong internal evidence of Irish production, and were given out later as the products of the genius of Shakespeare, with less fear of successful refutation in England. Their only fear of exposure lay in admissions made by someone from within, someone conversant with the plot and purpose of it all. This accounts, we believe, for the real cause of the death of Bacon, who was high in the Council of State, by the unscrupulous court cabal. This hierarchy had visualized Britain as a great ruling world power, and their purpose was to create a genius to correspond with England's ambition and exalted position. How well they succeeded is evident to all. Victor Hugo declared that Shakespeare was the chief glory of England, but their selection of a personage or character upon whom to father the result of their labors was a poor one. They had no idea at that day of the widespread diffusion of education, culture, and literary discrimination of the succeeding centuries. They attributed their works to a personage who did not measure up to the gift bestowed upon him. Despite all the assertion and reassertion of British writers to the claim that Shakespeare was the author of those works, they have never been quite able to convince the world of it. Until now it has remained an open question. Those who have accepted it are those who are prone to accept any fable or fiction emanating from the clergy without question, as they accepted their version of the story of the origin of the Bible and Savior. But discriminating and thinking persons refused, and rightly so, to accept the claim made that the uneducated and untutored actor was the author of those works which contained such evidence of knowledge so intimate and varied, as well as of exclusive associations which were beyond him. The deception has served the purpose it was intended for, to exalt English national self-esteem and reflect honor upon England, and to serve as an example for future generations of Englishmen to emulate. Such deception has even been practiced by our American biographers, but in lesser degree, and from a similar motive to stimulate American youth to emulation, by writing into the life of George Washington that he never told a lie. This idea, which furnished the motive for the deception of those works, is a potent one, and still is an important factor in the policy of British statecraft. This can be seen in the sentiment expressed by the King at the recent exercises over the new government building for the London County Council. This structure cost, according to the press, the sum of $17 million, an enormous amount, but the King, in justification of this great outlay, said that it would, quote, stimulate the development of that sense of citizenship which it is so imperative to cultivate, end quote. So the effect sought after through the substitution of those works is most obvious. The stimulation of English consciousness and national pride, and the glorification of English before the world. Those works are a wine of rare vintage, and they reflect the rich and ripe wisdom of the prime philosopher and scholiast, which Shakespeare the actor was not. Such ripe wisdom has ever been from time immemorial associated and identified with the cloister. It is but a piece with other deceptions emanating from the same source. The character Shakespeare is too weak to bear the mantle of Thoth. His selection was dictated by ambition and zeal rather than sound judgment, to say nothing of honesty. It is but an old and familiar ruse made use of by the British hierarchy to laud England. To get back to Rome, Augustus Caesar is also another fictitious character formulated to glorify Rome and commend her to the admiration of mankind for the noble characters she had produced. Augustus also represents the sun. Let it be not forgotten that the ancient Irish were the Hebrews and worshipped and idealized the sun god. The Roman Church, cruel and murderous by means of the sword, succeeded the Irish Church and has continued the idealization and worship of the Irish sun god IESA Christ under the name of Christianity. Augustus, then, represents the sun in the month of August. In the story or forged history, he is known by his ordinary name of Octavius, the 8th, for August is the 8th month of his course in his annual revolution. When he is crowned emperor or ruler, he is called Augustus. The priests have him reign for 44 years, and as he is getting old and feeble, he has a campaign on his hands against the German tribes in the north, where the sun's power is weak. So he sends his general, Varus, a fictitious character, from the Irish vara, meaning shaved, implying that the sun was shorn of his rays, loss of power, the impotent sun, who was defeated in the north in an engagement with the Germans in Teutoburg Wood, denoting loss of virility. When news of this disaster reaches Augustus, he is made to exclaim, quote, "O Varus, Varus, give me back my legions!" End quote. This loss of power he must have felt keenly, as he is feeble now and infirm. They have him lay down his burden and expire gracefully, as the September month is at hand, when the sun's power perceptibly declines. He is also deified. And this is Roman history, written by the priests to cover up Roman misdeeds, and intended to divert the minds of posterity from contemplating the awful tyranny, slaughters, suffering, and spoliations which were enacted during the period of Roman rule. It also flatters Roman vanity, and Augustus finds many admirers, especially among the English churchmen, who are as occupied as ever in keeping up the delusion and deception. In this Augustus myth we see again ideas borrowed from the mythology of the ancient Irish system of building up heroes and demigods personifying the qualities and attributes of the sun god. As is shown, they have used the Irish names as they thought that, as the Irish language was dead and its literature destroyed, There was no fear of the deception being discovered. Another falsehood is the myth introduced into Roman history by the priests in regard to the fictitious tribe called the Vandals. There never was a tribe of that name. It is an opprobrious name introduced by the British Roman priests and secretly intended as a term of execration for the Irish Church, Rome's opponent. It must be borne in mind that there had been a war which lasted for centuries between the Roman and Irish churches in the endeavor of the Roman Empire and Church to acquire the Irish papacy and dominate the world. In their histories, priests and churchmen allude to this struggle in a covert manner and refer to the adherents of the Irish Church as Arian Christians, that is, the followers of one fictitious Arius. They are said to have been a schismatic sect. But as a matter of fact, they were the first and original Christians from time out of mind, as the Irish Church of IESA was the original Christian church. As the Roman Church, by the aid of the English sword, finally prevailed, her historians have covertly introduced slanderous terms to apply to the Irish Church. For this purpose, they have given to history that strange and elusive tribe of barbarians that are said to have invaded Rome, and which impartial writers or investigators have never been able to discover. In fact, investigators have not been able to find who they were or what they had become of their descendants. Their identity has been lost. The name Vandal is but a calumnious term used by the Roman Church writers to apply to the early Christian or Irish Church and its adherents who resisted the authority of the usurping Roman Church. At the period of time that the Vandals are made to appear in the story, the Germans belonged to the Irish, hence the Arian Church, and were its militant upholders. The Roman wars against the Germans were primarily for religious conquest and were but a continuation of the age-long struggle between the two churches. It was religious motives that impelled the Germans to undertake the conquest of Italy and Gaul as a reprisal against Rome's invasion of Germany and her attack on the Irish Mother Church. And although the Roman Church prevailed in the end, she had to endure the loss of her physical power, the empire, which was overthrown by the supporters of the Irish Church. Since that time, in the succeeding centuries, the Roman Church has played a despicable part through bribery, trickery, and diplomacy in her endeavor to reacquire that lost physical or temporal power by playing off one prince against another. Nor did she stop at forgeries to that end. For example, the documents known as the Donations of Constantine and the false decretals, which were forged to bolster up her claim to the temporal power by showing that Constantine, when he withdrew to Constantinople, left her the sovereignty of Italy and the West. The subterfuge of the script or written word she has never hesitated to use for her deceitful and dishonest ends. She keenly felt the loss of the temporal power in her efforts to exact tribute from the people of the different countries and in her efforts to keep their rulers subordinate to her will. This loss of temporal power was particularly felt during the period of the Reformation. If she had had it at that time, the succeeding history of Europe and the world would have been another story. The term Vandal signifies desire. It is formulated from the Irish word andal, desire. In Irish, the word van signifies woman, therefore, the woman of desire or lust. The priest or church is ideally supposed to be at war with desire and lust, and as we speak of a church in the feminine gender, this term has been scurrilously applied to the institution of the Irish Church, on which, quote-unquote, virtuous Rome made war. Thus, the Vandals are a tribe invented and embodied in our histories for purposes of secret British and Roman slander against the early and original Christian church, a church whose traditions of godliness and virtue have come down to us and, without their identity as a body or church being known to them, have been the inspiration of the zealous among the Protestant Christian denominations of Europe and of our own country. At the period we are speaking of, Rome was entirely engrossed in war with the German tribes, and we can follow the Vandals very easily. The German tribe of the Visigoths or Western Goths invaded Spain and they were the only German tribe that made conquests in that country. Their descendants could be traced among the light-complexioned Spaniards for generations afterwards, and the naming of a province in Spain, Andalusia, after those Germans, shows for whom the term was intended and the purpose as stated above. But for the camouflage, the church scribes have made the Vandals cross over from Spain into Africa, the mythical region of desire and lust, and establish an empire there. After a time, they make a foray in their ships against Rome, which they capture and plunder. They carry away great loot with them back to Africa in their ships under their leader, 𝗫𝗍𝗺, the posterior from the Irish word geyser. And this is Roman history, as well as British propaganda, which has systematically slandered the Irish nation and church. The Vandals are said to have remained in Africa a period of 100 years, at the end of which time the Emperor of the East, Justinian, sent his general Belisarius, the Sun, to drive them out of Africa. In the so-called historic narrative, their descendants become quickly absorbed by the surrounding population, and in a few generations they disappeared from view, not a trace of them being left. This lying slander is secretly meant to convey the impression, through the leader 𝗫𝗍𝗺, that the Irish church was a church of sodomy. They have not merely stigmatized the first and true church and its adherents by calling them Vandals, but they have persistently laid such emphasis upon it that the term became a synonym for all that is cruel, barbarous, and destructive. In this way, they have given to fiction the appearance of fact. Our histories are sadly in need of honest and enlightened revision in order that this Roman and British fiction may be eliminated. For the myth of Constantine, we are indebted to the spurious historian Eusebius. He is used as the authority for ascribing a vision to Constantine in which he saw a fiery cross in the heavens with the words, "By this sign, conquer." The priestly fabricators who have written all the history which has been allowed to exist and come down to us from those times have made a special miracle for Constantine out of an everyday occurrence of the sun's appearance in the heavens. It is a natural phenomenon that on every bright day the sun, as it proceeds on its course, can be seen in the form of a cross in the sky. Any person can see it once the attention is called to it. It is seen in midsummer, in the spring and autumn, to the best advantage. Constantine is made to see it on the 27th day of October, on which day he is said to have defeated in battle Maxentius, who ruled Rome as emperor jointly with him. These things and personages are purely mythical and are taken from the Irish mythology. Conn is an Irish demigod or sun god. He is one of the mythological Irish kings. He is Conn of the 100 Battles, King Conn-cu-Barr, son of the heavenly wolf or sun god. As Rome stole the Irish Bible, savior, institutions, and traditions, as well as nomenclature, she stole also the name of one of the greatest of the Irish heroes to be founder of her church. Maxentius is a fictitious personage also, and the name is a compound of Latin and Irish, spelled in a camouflaged fashion, and alludes to the evil one. Max means great, and Antius is a name of the devil, really meaning great heat, from the aspect of the sun in midsummer when its heat is oppressive. Antias, the heat or great heat, is Irish or Celtic. Hence Maxentius, the fiery sun, loses its fierce heat by the 27th of October, and Conn, the genial sun, again reigns overhead. So we see here the secret allusion of the mythical adoption of the Irish sun god Conn by Rome in making him the founder of the Christian church under the title of the Emperor Constantine. The British have featured this myth also, with the allusion to the fact that Britain assisted Rome in bringing it about, as we find this fiction woven into the story that Constantine's parents were the Emperor Constantius and his wife, Queen Helena, who came from Britain. A wife is always an assistant and helpmate to her husband, so in this royal pair we have the two mythic characters doing duty as sponsors for their offspring, the mythical founder of the Roman Christian Church, Con, the sun god, and Helena, the moon. The moon is always said to be the spouse of the sun. That the church authorities who have appropriated this personage to whom to attribute the founding of their church acted consciously and with intent, insofar as to the character which he was meant to represent, be well understood by what Dr. Draper says regarding the honors paid Constantine. He says, quote, "His statue on top of the great porphyry pillar at Constantinople consisted of an ancient image of Apollo, whose features were replaced by those of the emperor, and its head surrounded by the nails feigned to have been used at the crucifixion of Christ, arranged so as to form a crown of glory." End quote. Apollo is the sun god. This clearly shows the false basis on which the claim of Rome rests. The name of her so-called founder, for obvious reasons, was not made use of until after the conquest of the Irish Church, when she appropriated as a part of the spoils the name of the mythical Irish demigod and hero king, the sun god Con, and for effect changed the name of Byzantium to Constantinople. This, we believe, is the truth beyond the possibility of contradiction. This explanation makes it easy to understand why Lord Macaulay, the English historian, so strongly commended the work of another English writer, Gibbon, by saying that, quote, "all who would write on Roman history must go back to the foundation laid down by Gibbon." End quote. All of which shows how thoroughly they have endeavored to establish a belief and confidence in an authorized version of history, ingeniously composed of a good deal of myth and fiction, and caused it to be accepted as fact. The events in the life of the Emperor Constantine are written so as to make his life read like the narrative of a series of incidents which might happen to a human being in such a role as that ascribed to Constantine. And as to his vision, the cross of light in the heavens is an aspect of the sun's appearance which was well known to the priest scribes. In the morning, before the sun reaches meridian height, by half closing the eyes one can see the great shaft of light streaming forth from the luminous orb toward the earth. This forms the upright staff of the cross of light, and on either side of the globe of the sun will be seen a great arm of light which forms the horizontal beam of the cross. Constantine's being made to hear the words spoken, "by this sign conquer," is suggested to the creator of this myth by the fact that every human being is in the form of a cross, to correspond to the solar orb. For when a man stands with body erect and arms extended laterally, he is in the form of a cross. This is where the myth-maker got the suggestion for his idea, and it is in this human body, shaped like a cross, that the ego or self must conquer his own lower nature, animal passions, appetites, lust, selfishness, and all other sinful qualities, in order that he may build up and become united with his luminous solar body, the spark of divine essence which is vouchsafed to every human being who will strive, by living a pure and enlightened moral life, to attain it, even though it requires many incarnations to achieve perfection or union with one's God, one's higher self. Eusebius has been called the father of lies, but it is not at all certain that such a man as Eusebius ever existed. His name has been useful to Roman Church historians in order to have someone to whom they could attribute sayings and writings which might have been and were written long afterwards, as it was a long and laborious task which Rome had to perform when she undertook the fabrication of history, both church and secular, that would be successful in deceiving posterity in all succeeding ages. This was set forth in a letter from Thomas to Gregory, when he said that, quote, "some were prone to censure and find fault with the work of the fathers, but for my part I am of the opinion that instead of finding fault with them, that their work should be commended with great praise rather than condemnation, considering the difficult nature of the work that they had to do." End quote. An idea of the method they employed in forging both history and scripture may be gleaned from the account left us by Bishop Faustus, who expresses his opinion in this wise, quote, "It is certain that the New Testament was not written by Christ himself nor by his apostles, but a long while after them by some unknown persons, who, lest they should not be credited when they wrote of affairs they were little acquainted with, affixed to their works the names of the apostles, or of such as were supposed to have been their companions, asserting what they had written themselves was written according to these persons to whom they ascribed it." End quote. Quoted in Bible Myths by T.W. Doane, page 460. Rome has always appreciated the value of the written word, and the book is a hoary institution, an adjunct to the priestly cult, to which the unsophisticated gave great credence. Therefore, for a long period of years, staffs of monks and priestly scribes were maintained in Rome and Britain, writing and composing false history to cover not only the so-called early beginnings of the Church, but of all the profane history of earlier times, in order that it might correspond and not conflict with the allegories of the Bible, which book, while it remained with the ancient Irish priesthood, was a record of spiritual idealisms and characters. When Rome appropriated this book, she strove at once to make of it a history, and to give IESA a realistic and historical character. So the names in the Bible of places which had simply a secret allusion to spiritual things and human qualities and conditions in man, in his progress from the animal to the spiritual state of perfection, were given a different meaning and were converted into bona fide history. Thus, with a shrewd conception and understanding of policy, Rome gave to the Irish Bible a history and a geography which, through her efforts to give it the appearance of truth as a record of actual occurrences and facts, have heaped woe and misery upon mankind. To perfect this project, Rome preached and instigated the wars of the Crusades. This was for the express purpose of getting possession of the countries of the East, and to give names to places in this country called Palestine or Syria, to correspond with the allegorical and cryptic names, Irish names, in the Bible. And Irish names they are still to this day, and this is the main reason why the Irish Roman Catholics of our day were not encouraged to read or study the Bible. It was because of this, too, that the Irish language was mainly suppressed and all but destroyed. To carry out this scheme of keeping the knowledge of these things from the world, Rome has conveniently invented a list of fictitious names which the priests assumed in order to set up authorities supposed to have lived in the periods of time assigned to them, and who would be cited by posterity to verify the falsifications which they had established as facts. Such are the names Herodotus, Manetho, Berosus, Josephus, Irenaeus, Origen, and Eusebius. These historians appear, in the light which we have today of her doings, as so many fictitious personages to whom to attribute writings which were done by the Roman and British priests of much later times. They were very busy concocting history after the English invasion of Ireland and the conquest of the Irish Church, and right away in the early part of the 13th century they set about altering the Irish Bible to make it their own. This revision or alteration took place about the year 1208 of our era. King James' agents have tried their hands at altering it since then, and it has been revised again in our day. At the time of this writing, the public press gives notice, under date of May 22nd, 1922, that in the Presbyterian Convention held at Des Moines, Iowa, there was a movement on foot for a shorter Bible, but it failed of adoption. So the original Irish Bible has been tampered with and altered from time to time according to the interests or purposes of those able to do it. Chapter 10. Hebrew, a sacerdotal dialect improvised from the Irish language for the secret use of the priests. A mystery once explained is a mystery no longer. Yet I hold that the solution and explanation of the Bible origin is of vastly more interest and benefit to mankind than to allow it to remain a secret and a mystery. Intellectual mankind needs to know the truth. Fables or fiction cannot be substituted for it, nor will the great mass of inquiring minds concede that the clergy is the only class that is entitled to know the truth, when it can be acquired, while the multitude may be regaled with fables and myths. It was in the spirit of this latter idea that the English churchman Dr. Burnet wrote his treatise De Statu Mortuorum, purposely in Latin, to instruct the clergy only, not for the benefit of the laity, saying that too much light is hurtful for weak eyes. Bible Myths, page 436. We do not agree with him in the sense that he wished to deceive men. Our purpose is to enlighten, and the proofs already given cannot be disputed or contradicted. The Old and New Testaments are just copies transcribed and made over and supplemented with additions from the ancient Aryan Gospels of the elder Magian priesthood of Arian or Aaron. I know that the Christian world will be surprised to learn that it has been so grossly deceived and imposed upon by Roman and English churchmen in this matter. Deception of the people as a policy was a principle on which both priesthoods were in hearty accord, much as they differed on denominational lines or in allegiance to different religious rulers. However, we have given out the real truth, and it cannot be denied, gainsaid, or explained away. The proof is now given out. It is as open and as plain as day for anyone who will take the trouble to investigate. Only a public ignorant of the Irish language could accept such a barefaced fraud. I declare that anyone who is at all competent to examine the facts as herein stated will be astonished to find it possible that such a lie could find credence. Under any other circumstances, only universal ignorance of the true facts could bring it about. Hence the Dark Ages were ushered in through the instrumentality of Rome and Britain. The very Bible names prove it. So also does the name of the Great Pyramid prove that it was built by this same order of the Irish Magian priesthood, the knowledge of which has also been suppressed. The Irish scriptures were palmed off on the world by Rome, with the aid of British priests who translated them into Greek, in order that it might pass for the original tongue in which they were composed. Then from that language they have been translated into other languages, such as Latin, Syriac, and others. The study of and instruction in the Irish language was not allowed, and as it was intended, it suffered a great loss in its cultural vocabulary. By this means they sought to drop all remembrance and to destroy all trace of the Bible origin and its authors. And this is why the Irish language was interdicted and forbidden to be taught in the schools or even to be spoken. At one time, the British government made it a crime punishable by death to speak it. See McGugan's History of Ireland. This makes it clear that the motive behind this policy was not, as hitherto advanced, solely a political one, but they found it convenient to retain the Irish idioms in the Bible for the name of God. It was difficult and next to impossible to find suitable substitutes in the translations for the ingenious and beautifully expressive titles of the deity and of the solar sun in the Irish language. It is the richest language in spiritual expression that has yet been evolved in which to utter praise to God. Sanskrit and Hebrew are its children or offspring. Both of these languages were composed and given written form by the Irish Aryan missionary priesthood, but at very different periods, hence the similarity of these languages to the Irish. Sanskrit was intended for the use of the priesthood, which the Irish missionaries established in India. It was changed to suit the vocal peculiarities of the people whose use it was intended for, just enough from the parent Irish in phonetic and inflectional aspects. There can be no doubt about it. Here is what Max Muller says. Quote, "The Semitic languages also are all varieties of one form of speech, though we do not know that primitive language from which the Semitic dialects diverged. Yet we know that at one time such language must have existed. We cannot derive Hebrew from Sanskrit or Sanskrit from Hebrew, but we can well understand how both may have proceeded from one common source. They are both channels supplied from one river, and they carry, though not always on the surface, floating materials of language which challenge comparison, and have already yielded satisfactory results to careful analyzers. End quote. Max Muller's observations show that he was on the right path to discover the mother language of these two branches. All that he had to do was to look across the narrow sea which separates England from Ireland and find it there. Or did he not know that Irish was the one river which supplied both channels and refrained from announcing it? He hits the nail so squarely on the head that it is hard to believe that so able and shrewd an investigator did not know. He was a professor of languages at Oxford, England, and well knew what an adverse statement would be aroused against him if he proclaimed it. He left it for another to do. England had for so long a time stood between Ireland and the rest of the world that after denuding her of her ancient landmarks and throwing a blanket of oblivion over her, he hesitated to remove it and be engulfed in the storm of wrath and enmity which he would arouse among the churchmen and the governing class of England. It is difficult for me to believe that so keen an observer was also, like so many other scholars and investigators, a credulous dupe deluded by the false histories of the past ages as written by the Roman and British priest scribes. No, it is quite obvious that he knew his England, and if he wished to retain his professorship and standing, he had to be careful as to what extent he disclosed his discoveries and convictions. He was treading on forbidden ground. Hebrew was a secret dialect which was devised by the Irish priesthood to preserve their secret lore and rituals. Its use was kept exclusively for the priests, thereby keeping all knowledge of sacerdotal things from the uninitiated or the laity. As it was composed and made use of by the Irish priests of IESA to preserve their secret lore, it was taken over and made use of by the Roman Church to conceal and to make plausible the secret fraud which she had perpetrated upon the Christian world. This explains why it was said that only one copy of the original first scriptures was written in Hebrew, and this also shows us why Hebrew is so nearly like the Irish language. To further this deception, she had them copied into Greek. This explains what has always been a puzzle to investigators, why the so-called Hebrew people who figured in the myth with Jesus as his apostles and who have their own cultural Hebrew language should write the four Gospels of the New Testament in Greek. Hebrew was never spoken by the Aramaic people of Syria, the so-called Jews, or by the people of any other country. It was used by the ancient Irish priesthood of IESA, precisely as Latin is today used in. The Roman priests know this to be true, and many of the Protestant clergy know it, and are conscious of being impostors and that they are perpetrating a cheat and a fraud which must be exposed for the scrutiny of the intellectual world of today. In my studies and investigations in search of knowledge and light, I became convinced that Hebrew was an artificially constructed language of the priests, as in our day we have the newly constructed languages of Esperanto and Volapük. I kept my discovery a secret, but in time I found that there were other investigators who had also discovered that Hebrew was not what the Roman and British churchmen have claimed it to be, that is, the national language of God's chosen people of a country in Asia, the Hebrew or so-called Jewish race. Here is what J.M. Price says, quote, "The Hebrew language was at first a secret sacerdotal jargon of Egyptian origin, and St. Gregory of Nyssa asserted, Oratio, page 12, that the most learned men of his day knew positively that it was not as ancient as other languages, and did not become the spoken language of the Jews until after their departure from Egypt." End quote. The Apocalypse Unsealed, page 98. The story of the Jews being captive in Egypt and later taking their departure from there is a pure myth, nicely constructed to deceive the unsophisticated, and represents the descent of the spirit of man into the flesh or body. The Jew represents the spirit, and Egypt, a cryptic name, represents the flesh or body. Egypt is a name formed for this purpose in the allegory. The Irish brought religion and civilization to Egypt, and that religion was sun worship. The word Jew is derived from an idiomatic Irish word yod, meaning the day or light. It alludes to the priests of the sun, the followers of the light, those who had wisdom. The word lud is camouflaged when it is converted into English by using the letter J instead of I to begin the word, there being no J in the Irish alphabet. So, by also leaving out the letters DH from the original Irish spelling, IUDH, the doctors have formulated the word Jew. This deception being unsuspected, it has served the tricksters until now. There are other idiomatic names in the Irish language for Jew and Hebrew, which give unmistakable proof that they are solely and truly of Irish origin. One of these names for Jew is Iul, pronounced Yule. It expresses the attributes of the sun when at his highest power and dignity, and is the name for the month Iul, July. It is from this idea, which originated with and was developed by the Irish priests of IESA, that was afterwards copied by the Roman Church priests when they wrote their false history of Rome and bestowed the names of the months of the year when the sun is at his greatest power upon two of their historic characters, Julius and Augustus Caesar. Iul signifies in Irish learning and knowledge. The Irish attributed these qualities to the sun, so in accordance with this idea, the Roman priests in their fictitious history have Julius Caesar write a book. Thus we have a history of Caesar's campaigns, a priestly composition. These attributes were ascribed to the sun by the Irish cult of IESA, and those who embraced the religious life were the Jews, and not our poor brothers who own the city of New York. A friend once told me that he had heard it stated that the Irish were the Hebrews. At the time, I thought the statement absurd, and it made no impression. I took it more as a witticism or perhaps a cynical remark. But to my own surprise, I have found that the statement was the real truth as regarding the ancient Irish. It is very evident to me, then, that St. Gregory would make a play of exposing the recent origin of the Hebrew language if, by so doing, he could establish that it really ever was the language spoken by the fictitious Jewish people who were claimed to have been held as captives in historic Egypt. This is an example of how spurious authority has been set up by priest scribes to make a fiction appear like fact, to make a false impression on the minds of men. A recent writer in the public press made the statement that, quote, the Irish language was spoken in the Garden of Eden, end quote, thereby implying that it was the God-given and original language of Adam and Eve and of the first patriarchs, biblical characters, and of the master adepts who wrote the first scriptures and formulated the mythical legend of our first parents, placing them in the Garden of Eden. There is no doubt as to whom we are indebted for the Bible. It is the plainest and most evident truth, stripped of the disguise under which it has for so long a time been hidden by the British and Roman churchmen. Any scholar and thinker cannot fail to so recognize it, and many will blush to think that they did not see through it before. The statement above quoted regarding the Irish language in the absence of correct knowledge passed unnoticed, no doubt, by the general public, and, so far as I could see, brought no comment in the press. But to me, who had been engaged in research work in that line of study, it was full of significance. Whoever the writer may have been, he did not specify that it was the Hebrew language that was spoken by our first parents, but instead the Irish language. It would indeed be a strange phenomenon in the growth of language if two peoples of such different racial stocks living so far apart in geographical location as Ireland and Syria, should speak the same or nearly the same language, and all the more so when it is a cultural language without there being a direct and special cause for its easy to understand. It is a self-evident impossibility. The word Hebrew is derived from the Irish root word 𝗼𝗄, spelled alternatively AODH and AOI, meaning fire, the Vesta of the ancient Irish priests of the sun. The word in Irish is éabhrach, which has been anglicized into Hebrew. 𝗼𝗄 also signifies a cause, matter in course of change, a compact, a confederacy, the learned, a vocation, learning, science, wise, a flock, knowledge, discipline, instruction, honor, respect, a country, an island, a tribe. This definition of the word 𝗼𝗄 aptly applies to the cult of men which are meant to be secretly known by the term Hebrew. So it is the name of a high order or degree of the ancient Irish priests of the sun, or the religion of IESA, the sun god. They were the priests of the sacred fire. So from the root word 𝗼𝗄 we get the word Heber, Heber, meaning fire, who is figuratively the brother of the sun, and hence a Hebrew, the priest of the sun, all of which proves the Irish origin and character of the Hebrew Bible and its spiritual ideals and truths. It is this Irish evidence in the Bible which undoubtedly caused the idea to be advanced that the Irish were the two lost tribes of Israel, which is but further evidence of confusion worse confounded. As there never were two lost tribes in the sense set forth, it is purely mythical. The following is a list of Irish words which have been jargonized with their Hebrew form. I might easily extend the list, but this number of words will suffice to prove, as stated, that Hebrew is but a secret dialect reconstructed from the Irish for the use of the priesthood. Some words given here of both Irish and Hebrew are synonyms. Others are slightly changed in meaning and form, but plainly showing that they are of common origin. Such, for instance, are the Irish words ciocras, pronounced cucras, meaning hunger, and the word kis, pronounced kis, meaning rent. The Hebrew form of the first word is chikeo, meaning his palate, and the second word has the same form as in the Irish and means a purse. Some words also have two or more forms which are given. This list makes it very clear that a great deception has been practiced upon the world. Every Celtic scholar, investigator, and thinker will at once comprehend the incontrovertible nature of the proof here submitted in this list of Irish words with their Hebrew derivatives as to who the Jews and Hebrews were. British and Roman lies cannot prevail against it. The ancient Irish priesthood of IESA had not only a secret system of writing called OGHAM, O-G-H-A-M, but they had also special dialects formulated from the Irish language, each being a perfect language in itself, such as for law, music, etc. One of these dialects was our so-called Hebrew language, which was reserved exclusively for the use of the Irish priests. It was used for the ritualistic purposes and to secretly preserve their spiritual ideals. It was made use of by the Roman Church after the suppression of the Irish Church. From this list of words, it can be seen that the Hebrew words are just altered and changed enough from the original to deceive the unsuspecting among the Irish laity, who by chance might happen to have access to it. But to the non-Irish of a later day, or people of other races, it could easily be made to appear as an original language developed by a distinctly different race of people, said to be called Hebrew. So, by means of suppressing the cultural Irish language, it was easy for Rome, with the aid of her British confederates, to easily enough palm off on the world the Hebrew Bible. It was translated into Greek in accordance with the plan for concealment and for the purpose of staging the drama of the Bible story and episodes over in Palestine. It has been transcribed and altered many times since, but even yet its ancient landmarks are still there. The people who settled these American colonies knew nothing of the fraud that was perpetrated on them regarding the Scriptures, and they have unwittingly passed on the deception to the people of our day. With the aid of the art of printing and the zeal of creed propaganda, the deception has spread among the ignorant masses as well as among the so-called enlightened, with the exception of the Roman English clergy. No impartial student can study the Irish language without becoming convinced that it is the original language of the Scriptures. Ample proof of this fact will be found all through these pages, and even in the short list of Irish and Hebrew words which has been submitted here. The Irish Roman Catholic priests who have been the custodians of the literary language have been guilty of deletion, and it is evident that in the compilation of Irish dictionaries there are many omissions of words, a thing not to be wondered at when the purpose behind such omission is known. However, there is sufficient evidence left to prove the Bible to be of unmistakable Irish origin, without a shadow of doubt, and also to furnish convincing evidence that the ancient Irish were the so-called chosen people of the Bible story. The man who was striving to live a spiritual life was an 𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗀𝘀, Jew from Lud, the day, showing that he was a disciple or a devotee of the Son. Those who had advanced and were seeking a higher order of spirituality are, in the Bible story, called the Israelites, or disciples of IESA, the God of the Son and his Spirit in man. The average man, or the common run of humanity, is comprehended in the term Philistine. This word is taken from the Irish word Fil, F-U-I-L, pronounced Phil, meaning blood. It also signifies a family or tribe. In its biblical application, it comprehends all those who are absorbed in carnal things, the flesh and the world, rather than the things of the Spirit, so meaning the worldly ones. With this revelation of truth, we can see readily why the assembly of clerics who revised the Bible from time to time always did so behind closed and barred doors. They were put under oath not to reveal the matters which were discussed while that work was being done, a conspiracy to suppress and hide the truth from the people. We must consider that Christian theology is taken bodily from the ancient Irish concept of the beneficent and creative Son for a center and ideal, and disguised it so that it could not be traced. Recognizing that fact, and knowledge of the Irish language will enable any investigator to recognize the original parent language of the Bible. The great injustice done to the Irish people and the so-called Jews of our day becomes at once apparent. The theological idea of the ancient Irish priesthood was that the Son was the Logos, the Creator, and the greatest representative of God. It was through the Son that all good came to mankind. The Son was the great being through whom was received light and knowledge. All good came through the Son, and he was the greatest visible representative of the great unseen deity. Any man among the Irish who was ready to enter the search for light, the spiritual life, was known as a 𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀, Jew, and entered into the path of the spiritual life. The Son was the embodiment of all that was good, and the Irish personified him as a champion, warrior, and hero whom they strove to emulate. There is no mistaking the ideals and idiomatic names in the Irish language, the first cultural language on this point, as the following words will show. From the word lug, day, we get 𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗀, pronounced 𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗀, 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 three different forms to express the name Jew, which stood for the followers of the day or sun. And the Irish word 𝗰𝗵𝗪𝗀, judgment, is from the same root. These words are not borrowed words engrafted on the language, but are of the parent stem. Another name of Jew, deep-rooted in the Irish language and all the sophistry in Roman or English high churchdom, cannot remove it. It is Łuil, L-U-I-L, pronounced Łuil, a Jew. Why does this happen to be so? It is because with the ancient Irish priesthood of the Son, the embodiment of all good, he was, in his highest power, and potency after climbing the hill up to the sun's day, the 24th of June, during the month of Yule, July. He manifested himself in warm, sunshiny days, dispensing his beneficence to all nature and to mankind. These warm days were, metaphorically speaking, called his companions, and therefore were said to be his disciples. The month of Yule was the month of his essential power and warmth, and from that fact his initiated devotee of the priesthood of IESA was called an Yule, or Jew, after the sun's aspect and attributes. As the sun is the visible center of light, he is the great teacher. He contains and imparts to mankind all light and knowledge. All who are wise in esoteric things recognize this to be true. As to his natural aspect in relation to the physical world, his beneficence and influence are everywhere manifested. All earthly life depends upon the sun. The Irish word Yule signifies knowledge, learning, art, science, judgment, a way, attendance, light, the month, Yule, and Yule, a Jew. From the same root we get the words IULAIDHE, a leader, IULLAGACH, sprightly, light, cheerful, IULMHAR, wise, judicious, IULMHARACH, skillful. These facts and the lesson of truth they convey can be verified by anyone who will investigate. The Duke of Argyll, in The Unity of Nature, says, quote, "We have found in the most ancient records of the Aryan language proof that the indications of religious thought are higher, simpler, and purer as we go back in time." End quote. Quoted in Donnelly's Atlantis, page 447. We have taken our readers back to the etymological foundation of the word Jew. It is of the very warp and woof of the first cultural language that was spoken in this round of existence, the language evolved by the great Magian priests of Era during thousands of years before their migration towards the east to give light and knowledge to the younger and undeveloped races of mankind. Chapter 11. The Irish, the first cultural nation, the earliest missionary teachers, and the great temple builders of the ancient world. One of the aims of the propaganda for spreading misinformation regarding Ireland was to create an impression, because of a similarity between the customs of the Irish and those of the Hindus, that the Irish and their customs came originally from the East or India. Really, on the contrary, this fact only confirms the truth that the Irish gave their customs to the Hindus during their missionary sojourn in that country. The Hindus have never been known as a colonizing race, while we have overwhelming evidence to show that Ireland was the greatest colonizing country of the ancient world. They were the real pathfinders of the world. As to the likelihood of a Hindu migration to Ireland in the past, the author of Atlantis says on page 416, quote, "The Hindus have never, within the knowledge of man, sent out colonies or fleets for exploration, but there is abundant evidence, on the other hand, of migrations from Atlantis eastward. And how could the Sanskrit writings have preserved maps of Ireland, England, and Spain, giving the shape and outline of their coasts and their very names, and yet have preserved no memory of the expeditions or colonizations by which they acquired that knowledge?" End quote. Once the plain truth is made known, the plot of the conspirators becomes evident on all sides, and the fabricators of spurious history are seen to have gone to such absurd lengths, among others, as to invent the fabulous tale of the lost continent of Atlantis, described by Plato, in order to carry out their purpose to obscure Ireland's great past. This great past, if known, would at once prove to the whole world that Ireland was the original parent country of learning, the sciences, and spiritual culture, and that the motherland of true religion. This fact is cryptically preserved by tradition and the myth that schools were established there by 𝗰𝗵𝗶𝘀, which name means doctor or professor of science, and indicates the high hierophant of the Irish Magian sun cult. It is also alluded to in the story of Cadmus, first one, the first to establish schools. It is further confirmed by the tradition, veiled in cryptic form, that long before real or actual schools were established there, a certain Phineas Pharsa, from Finn, the sun, and Phar, a man, a Phoenician, had established schools on the plains of Shinar, we, ourselves. This fabled place, for the purpose of deception, has been located in Persia. Thus, Phineas Pharsa and the plains of Shinar is but a secret allusion to the fact that the Irish Magian adept cult of the sun worship, who here on this island were the first men to develop the latent or potential intellectual and spiritual powers within themselves, here erected the first schools and laid the foundation for all the culture, religious and secular, which exists in the world today. This is a fact of fundamental truth, which nothing can shake or destroy. It is attested to on all sides, upon close examination, by the cultural idioms of the Bible and the esoteric truths preserved in the symbolic monuments of the Great Pyramid group in Egypt and elsewhere in the East. They have left indisputable evidence of this culture in the religious rites and institutions which they have introduced here when they brought sun worship and civilization to both North and South America. There is the most incontestable proof of this, as will be shown later on. This purpose to obscure a knowledge of her history and institutions may be further seen in the effort which has been made to create a doubt as to the origin of her round towers and the purpose for which they were erected. There is no doubt whatever in the writer's mind but that the round tower has always been a stubborn fact for them to dispose of, and we are not surprised to find that they have on hand records, fabricated since the invasion, which will show that many of those towers were destroyed by an act of nature instead of by the willful acts of ruthless destroyers. One of the methods employed by those fabricators to isolate and minimize Ireland's historical importance is pretty well reflected, as will be noted, in the description given by Diodorus Siculus, intended for effect on posterity, portraying her as some obscure and little-known island in some remote and unfrequented part of the Atlantic Ocean, just as if he were introducing a knowledge of her to the world for the first time, or preserving her very name from oblivion. The excerpt which will show this implied mendacity on the part of Diodorus will also include as an authority the untruthful Giraldus Cambrensis. In referring to the latter, Mr. Donnelly is evidently not aware of his untruthful character, so we find him again, among others, in his role as an authority, as was intended. Regarding the round towers, those unique and peculiarly original Irish monuments connected with sun worship, Mr. Donnelly says, quote, "Attempts have been made to show by Dr. Petrie and others that these extraordinary structures are of modern origin and were built by the Christian priests in which to keep their church plate, but it is shown that the annals of Ulster mention the destruction of 57 of them by an earthquake in AD 448, and Giraldus Cambrensis shows that the loft nave was created by an inundation or sinking of the land in AD 65. End quote. Moreover, we find Diodorus Siculus in a well-known passage referring to Ireland and describing it as, quote, "an island in the ocean over against Gaul to the north, and not inferior in size to Sicily, the soil of which is so fruitful that they mow there twice in the year." End quote. Donnelly goes on to say, quote, "he mentions the skill of their harpers, their sacred groves, and their singular temples of round form." End quote. Atlantis, page 416. We here see a conflict of opinion in the statements attributed to Dr. Petrie and others in Diodorus Siculus. We are reminded of a proverb which says, "A lie must have long legs or it will be overtaken." The propagandists have evidently suffered a lapse of memory right here on this point regarding the antiquity of those towers. The effect of all this false information has been to set men astray in their quest for a solution as to what country or people we are indebted to for those monuments. Sir John Lubbock, quoted in Atlantis, page 417, says, quote, "They have been supposed by some to be Scandinavian, but no similar buildings exist in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, so that this style of architecture is no doubt anterior to the arrival of the Northmen." End quote. That is, their arrival in Ireland. It seems puerile and absurd that any investigator possessing even the ordinary amount of acumen necessary to deal with the subject of the Round Towers should honestly think, much less circulate the opinion, that the towers were built in Roman Christian times, and give as a reason that it was a place where the priests kept their church plate. It is, to say the least, disingenuous. The knowledge necessary to the solution of the question of the Round Towers is not obscure or remote from men who, even in a small measure, have given thought to the investigation of things symbolic. The explanation of the Round Tower is simple, and the purpose of its use easy to apprehend. This understanding will at once enable anyone to determine in what country it originated and who the builders were. Those who are responsible for disseminating misinformation know this fact well. The misinformation is but a part of the plan of concealment. The Round Tower is peculiarly an Irish or Aryan symbol of the sun worship. In their worldwide migrations to preach the gospel, the Irish erected the towers in association with their temples. They are symbols of the phallus and represent the creative power of God through the Lord Sun IESA, both in nature and in man. It has a natural, mystical, and spiritual significance. The same idea has been borrowed and embodied in the modern church spire. The remains of those towers are found as far apart from Ireland as India in the east, and from Ireland to New Mexico and Colorado in the west. The author of Atlantis, page 418, most pertinently says, quote, "It will not do to say that the resemblance between those prehistoric and singular towers in countries so far apart as Sardinia, Ireland, Colorado, and India is due to an accidental coincidence." End quote. It is sometimes necessary, in dealing with a shameless and persistent propaganda of falsehood, to speak in a plain and direct manner, especially against powerful and subtle agencies which have been able, through means of the written page as a medium for misrepresentation, either by alteration or by omission altogether, so successfully to obliterate and reduce to an unimportant and insignificant character the history or story of the greatest nation of ancient times, if not of all time. The commercial greatness of this nation was unrivaled. Her universities and schools of learning, not only in medieval times but anciently, made her the intellectual sun of Europe, as Professor Sigerson of Dublin recently declared. Without any exaggeration whatever, and with justice, we may supplement his statement and say that she was truly the intellectual light of the whole world. Her ethical culture has never been equaled, let alone surpassed, as evidenced by our Bible, which, when rightly understood with its ideal counterpart in stone, the great pyramid temple pillar of IESA, is her crowning glory. So it becomes very apparent why there has been such an amount of feigned ignorance regarding the origin of the Round Towers and the failure of those with knowledge to give out correct information about them. It is absolutely certain, and without a shadow of doubt, that the papal hierarchy at Rome, and its members in Britain and Ireland as well, were in possession of this knowledge, and that they also had a lively knowledge of the long and continuous intercourse between Ireland and the American continent, or land of the West. The traditions of this intercourse never died out among the Irish. The old tradition of St. Brendan sailing to the land of the West in A.D. 545 from the foot of the great headland in Kerry which bears his name is but merely a ray to shed light upon this fact. There is evidence that the fact of this intercourse was a common tradition along the Atlantic coast of Europe. and it is safe to say that Rome knew of the colonizations made by the Irish on the western continent and of the religious establishments which it was their wont to set up wherever they planted a colony. With due caution to the reader to make a proper allowance for the attempt of the Roman churchmen always to connect the Irish with the Roman Church, we will let the Abbé Brasseur de Brambourg speak on this point. In a note to his translation of the sacred book of the Mayas, the Popol Vuh, quoted in Atlantis, page 419, he says, quote, "There is an abundance of legends and traditions concerning the passage of the Irish into America, and their habitual communication with that continent many centuries before the time of Columbus. We should bear in mind that Ireland was colonized by the Phoenicians, or by people of that race. An Irish saint named Vigil, who lived in the 8th century, was accused to Pope Zachary of having taught heresies on the subject of the Antipodes. At first he wrote to the Pope in reply to the charge, but afterward he went to Rome in person to justify himself, and there he proved to the Pope that the Irish had been accustomed to communicate with the transatlantic world." In view of the knowledge which we possess today and the belief which is founded upon that knowledge, it is worthwhile to consider here, if but briefly, some of the circumstances connected with the voyage of Columbus. In the accounts, be it remembered, we have been informed that he sought aid from the church fathers. He traveled about from one church establishment to another, and it is said that he went to Rome to seek aid there. However that may be, a junta composed mostly of the church fathers in Spain, after hearing his views and beliefs, refused him assistance or approval. This opposition lasted for a number of years, but was later evidently withdrawn, as we find that it was through the influence of a father confessor of a Spanish monastery that King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella fitted out the expedition which enabled Columbus to embark upon the voyage westward. Spain at the time, with its king and queen, was almost completely under the church influence. We are told that Columbus's reason for embarking on this voyage was an ardent desire to plant the standard of the cross in the new lands which he might discover, and that he believed that by sailing westward he would be able to find a new trade route to the Indies. These reasons which have been given out are specious and may be dismissed as not being the true motives. As for the desire to set up the cross, we will see that this expedition and subsequent ones, under the leadership of the priests, destroyed the cross wherever they found it on this western hemisphere, and we may also set aside as fiction the fitting out of the expedition to discover a new trade route to the east, because the Turks or Muslims dominated the overland trade route to that part of the world. In the absence of knowledge, this latter reason has appeared plausible. In order to sustain this impression as to the object of the voyage, we are told that the two commercial and trading republics of Venice and Genoa suffered most by the loss of the eastern trade route, and that they were especially clamorous for the discovery of a new route to the east. Now, if this were a fact, why did not these two states, each comprising a seafaring people equipped with fleets and eager for commerce and trade, send their fleets to the west to trade and make discoveries after the news of Columbus's successful voyage had spread abroad? They were the two greatest maritime states in the Mediterranean, if not in Europe, at that time. If they needed a trade route so badly, would they not have entered into competition with the other nations for their share of the trade and spoils? Instead of those two states, whom we have been told wanted it most, we find Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Holland monopolizing the trade and the spoils of discovery. None of these nations were better equipped for overseas trade or voyages than Venice and Genoa, and it is rather surprising that the latter did not engage in the western trade. If their need were so great, would not the Pope, when he assumed to divide the New World into spheres, allotting one to Spain and another to Portugal, be very likely to assign spheres, respectively, to those two Italian city-states? The whole thing is merely a part of the fabric of lies invented to conceal the real motive for projecting the voyage. Columbus was said to have been a Genoese, but discoveries have been made since which show that he was a Spanish subject, born and bred in Spain. Thus it is obvious that the alleged reasons for the voyage are false and will not do. They have been accepted heretofore without close examination. There was another and far more urgent reason for the voyage, but before proceeding to give the real cause back of it, let us dispose of the excuse of the Turkish or Muslim menace to commerce between Europe and the East, which was but dust for the eyes, so that men would not be able to see the real motive. There had been constant commerce carried on between the West and East, not only during the period of time we are dealing with, but long before and since over the land and sea route from the Mediterranean through Constantinople and by devious routes eastward. The Muslims have dominated the main eastern overland route for more than 700 years. There was a partial interruption to their sway during the Crusades when the Christians held the kingdom of Jerusalem for a period of 88 years. This kingdom fell in 1187 AD, and the period of the Crusades came to an end about 1285 AD. It was not the Turk who stood in the way of commerce or trade as such. The Crusades were brought on by Rome, who instigated the Christian nations of Europe to attack the Muslims in order that she might possess the so-called Holy Land. The Turks were forced to defend themselves and the land which had been in their hands for some centuries, but there was no unsurmountable barrier to peace if Rome had wished peace, when again the stream of commerce could have resumed its wonted flow. The Turks have never abjured trade or commerce. During the wars of the Crusades, the most frightful massacres and excesses were committed due to Christian fanaticism. Yet despite all this, the Muslim king Saladin of Egypt and the Greek emperor Alexius of Byzantium had no difficulty in coming to a mutual understanding and making peace between themselves and the peoples of their respective countries. But with the Roman Church, it was different. The Fatimite Caliph of Egypt wanted to make peace with the Roman Church cohorts, and he offered to guarantee to all unharmed pilgrims an unmolested sojourn of 1 month in Jerusalem, and to aid the Crusaders on their march to the Holy City if they would acknowledge his supremacy within the bounds of his Syrian Empire. His proposal for peace was rejected. Rome was out for spoils and possessions to increase her income and power. The onus belongs to Rome for whatever of interruption there was to commerce with the East, and this could have been removed at any time, we believe, if Rome had earnestly desired it. It can readily be seen that the demand for a new trade route could not have been very strong, or Rome would have had to yield to it. So we may dismiss this reason as an invention. Moreover, if a new trade route was to be found, why look to the westward for it? We have been taught to believe, through interested sources, that the Western Ocean, in the time of Columbus, was believed to be an unknown and limitless waste of waters, holding the most forbidding and frightful terrors, and peopled by hideous monsters of gruesome shapes, who would destroy anyone venturesome enough to attempt to go far to the westward. After the conquest and absorption of the Irish Church, such fictions may have been spread among the masses by the Roman Church priests, and in a few generations they would have found a wide belief. If so, they served a purpose for Rome for the time being, while she was consolidating her conquests in different parts and strengthening her organization for future expansion and growth. The astute leaders of the Church held no such notions regarding the Western Ocean. The mental medicine they prescribed for the multitude is something apart, and always has been, from what they themselves partake of. So on that point there is not the least room for doubt, for if they believed such silly fiction, it is only reasonable to suppose that they would not have had at any time favored the project. That the voyage had another objective than that given out by the priests, we may well believe. The circumstances under which the voyage was promoted and aided merits a much more extended elucidation than I am privileged, from the nature of this work, to give here. Let me briefly call attention to the struggle in which Ferdinand and Isabella were engaged with the Moors in an endeavor to reclaim the kingdom of Granada. The completion of this struggle left the king and queen as exhausted of all means as did the Crusades leave practically all Europe, and more especially did the fathers of the church feel the effects due to the Crusades and the loss of revenue from the properties and privileges which they had formerly held, but which were now taken over by the kings and nobility to recoup, in a measure, the losses sustained in those wars to advance the interests of the church organization. This state of affairs had a direct bearing on the project of Columbus's voyage and on the final decision to promote it. The resources of Ferdinand and Isabella were so low that she had to pledge her jewels in order to find the means to furnish the necessary vessels and supplies. The war against the Moors, which reduced Spain to such an extremity, was waged, in a measure, as much as in behalf of the Church, to banish the infidel and reclaim the country for Christendom, as it was to regain the country for the crown of Spain. The country, as a consequence, was in a terrible state of poverty, and the Church was also financially lean. This state of affairs, coupled with the fear that, owing to the persistence of Columbus in seeking aid which might be granted by someone whom the Church could not control, caused them, after due deliberation, to promote the voyage at that particular time. That the papal authorities at Rome had long possessed a pretty good knowledge of the Irish intercourse with the western continent, we may well believe. This knowledge they obtained from the Irish priests, as stated by the Abbé Brasseur de Bourbourg. In fact, it would have been next to impossible to have kept this knowledge from them, as Ireland was the greatest maritime nation in the world, and the one with which Rome had the longest struggle we have any record or tradition of. So it goes without saying that the hierarchy at Rome knew that the Irish Church of IESA had established Christianity, or sun worship, on the western continent. This knowledge must have been confirmed by the Irish priests who were brought into the Roman Church organization at the time of the suppression of the Irish Church. So, when the project of the Western Voyage was first proposed, it was looked upon with ill favor by the Church Fathers, because they considered it inopportune and the time inauspicious. They feared that the voyage would lead to the discovery and revelation of facts before the whole world which would be damaging to the Church. Therefore they tried to dissuade Columbus, under various pretexts and discouragements, to give up the idea, and in every manner possible, by argument, ridicule, and false logic, to convince him that he held erroneous ideas concerning the shape of the earth. By a display of superior learning, they sought to convince him that his theory and beliefs were alike fallacious. In the light of what transpired, it seems that those men, when they found that they could not dissuade Columbus from his purpose, parried for delay, and in the meantime they formulated a plan of policy by which they could prevent intelligence of any damaging facts which might be discovered from spreading abroad. It was only after this decision was made, we believe, that enough information about the western continent and the great wealth which existed there was made known privily to Ferdinand and Isabella. And it was this information which decided her to sell her jewels, her very last available assets, to finance the expedition. Considering the war in which the royal pair were then engaged and the sacrifices which they had already made to advance the interests of the Church, it is not reasonable to suppose that the priests would have encouraged or advised her to part with her jewels, her last penny, to back a wild and foolish proposition, as they had hitherto held it to be. But they now gave both her and the king assurances that the outcome of the voyage was a certainty beyond merely the ordinary hazards of the sea. In view of the knowledge in our possession, a fact may be stated here, one of no little importance in this connection, and that is that a companion of Columbus on this voyage is listed on the rolls as William, the Irishman, from Dublin. In view of the importance which is attached to this enterprise, and what was openly staked upon it by his royal patron and secretly expected of it by the Church Fathers, it is but natural to suppose that men of the best nautical skill and knowledge were secured to assist Columbus. So it is only fair to assume that this person was sea-wise in the knowledge of the Irish mariners, who were formerly the unrivaled sea voyagers of the world, from time out of mind, the nearest competitors, but far inferior in range, being the Norse of a later day. This Irishman, William, may have previously made such a voyage himself, which might account for his being with Columbus on this voyage. If such was the case, no record of it would have been allowed to exist. The systematic suppression of facts, which is almost beyond belief, of the history of Irish achievements is most shameless and barefaced, carried on by agencies already mentioned. It is the plainest fact that Ireland's history has been written by her enemies. However, it is important to note that an Irishman was one of the personnel of that voyage. He was of the race of seamen who made voyages across the Western Ocean and had a constant intercourse with the people of this American continent from the time of the Bronze Age, see Atlantis, Art, Bronze Age in Europe, page 237, 246, 249, 259, 266, and 267. It is a fair conjecture, to say the least, that he brought some particular and special knowledge to Columbus and was familiar with the seafaring traditions of his race. The Church Fathers, in all essentials, practically ruled the Spanish kingdom and were the closest advisors of the king and queen. Those shrewd men, crafty strategists, with a world perspective for their organization, knew of the Irish church colonization on the opposite side of the Atlantic, and that it was from there that the priests of the Irish church obtained the gold and silver for their church service and for the ornaments of their symbolic monuments, pyramids, temples, towers, obelisks, and dolmens. Ireland itself, so far as known, never yielded more than a small amount of those metals, and they were dedicated to the use of the sun worship. The policy decided upon, judging by what actually occurred, was to place a close censorship upon the voyage. The same policy was applied to subsequent voyages, and all along we find the priest accompanying every voyage and in the van of every expedition. He was there to observe everything discovered and to bring back a report to his superiors, and more especially to take note of the religious state and conditions which were found existing in the western land. He was there also for the purpose of mutilating and destroying whatever evidence might be found that would be injurious or damaging to the claims of the Roman Church. This evidence was found in abundance everywhere, as will be shown. All things considered, there was no other hypothesis but this outstanding fact upon which to account for the sack and ruin of temples and altars, monuments and symbols, as well as the destruction of cities, coupled with the awful killings and massacres committed by the Spaniards, dominated by the priests, upon a highly civilized, peaceable, and practically unarmed people. They received the Spaniards as friends, even as the traditional fair gods, bearded white men, the Irish magi, returning to them again, as was expected and promised. They received them with open hospitality and welcome. The recompense they received in turn was frightful and savage. They were slaughtered, with the result that in a few short years the population was reduced in numbers, their leaders killed off, their civilization destroyed, and their temples and religious institutions ruined. This happened not only in Mexico, but also in Yucatan and Peru. It is not my purpose to go into this phase of Spanish policy extensively here, much less to treat of the enslavement of the natives, but only to show the underlying motive that was back of such action on the part of the Spaniards. This will be seen by what the priests discovered. They found here, as was expected, an abundance of proof of the Irish or Aryan connection with the religious institutions in Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere on this American continent. They were practically the same in both North and South America. It was the Irish sun worship or Christianity which prevailed among the civilized inhabitants of both continents. The name Cusco, the capital of Peru, the seat of the sun worship in South America, testifies to their establishing a colony there. For Cusco is an Irish name of the sun god, from case, C-A-I-S, meaning an eye, haste, a twist or turn, whirling, a stream, love, virility, of the sun in spring. The sun god 𝗃𝗃 is still worshipped to this day, not only in Ireland, but throughout the entire Christian world on Damaig Casca, Easter Sunday, the day of the risen sun in springtime. The city of Cusco was the seat of the Ainca, A-I-N-C-A, or Inca, or head of the sun worship, in the southern continent. These facts alone, even in the absence of other direct, positive, and indisputable proof, should leave no doubt whatever as to who discovered and civilized ancient America. I will briefly mention some only of the rites and customs which the Spanish priests found here in the religious worship of the people. They found, among other things, the worship of the Holy Virgin Mother and Child. She was worshipped as the Mother of God. The annunciation that she was to be the mother of the Savior was made to her by an angel, and the child became the crucified Savior who died on the cross. This Savior fasted for 40 days on a mountain and was tempted by Satan, the same as IESA, Jesus. They found here the sacrament of the Eucharist and communion. They also found the institution of prayer, confession, belief in the forgiveness of sin, fasting, and the doing of penance. They found the practice of baptism, where the infant was baptized with water and the sign of the cross. This water washed away sin, and the child was born anew. They found the Irish institution of religious houses, both for virgin women who dedicated their lives to the service of God, and for men who led a chaste and pure life. They found the cross and crucifix held in great veneration everywhere in Mexico, Yucatan, and in Peru. In brief, I may say that they found in practice here in America about all of the religious rites which were brought here by the ancient priests of the Irish Church of IESA, and which were identical with what is now called Roman Catholic Christianity. They formulated this religion originally and spread it around the world to all peoples who were capable of receiving it. It is not surprising at all if, during a period of thousands of years, it became affected with some slight changes. It would be strange if it did not. Time has affected change in all religion. Here's what the Reverend J.P. Lundy says of the rite of baptism and the manner in which it was given. Quote, American priests were found in Mexico beyond Darien, baptizing boys and girls a year old in temples at the cross, pouring the water upon them from a small pitcher. End quote. In South America, the natives took baths as a religious rite to cleanse away sin, and a very natural, but for all a remarkable thing about it is that the Irish name of those baths have survived for those thousands of years and have come down to us to confront and refute those despicable frauds who have stolen the fruits of the great Irish apostles, who were the first to preach the gospel of the Word to the whole world. Those baths were called opacuna, or the bath of sins, that is, the bath for the cleansing of sin. The Irish word for sin is paca, and pacuna means the sins. These facts leave no room for doubt as to whom we owe the civilization of Mexico, Yucatan, and Peru, and elsewhere on this American continent. A Spanish priest, the Reverend Father Acosta, in speaking of the religious rites and customs of the natives, says, quote, The Indians had an infinite number of other ceremonies and customs which resembled the law of Moses, and some of these which the Moors use, and some approaching near the law of the gospel, as the baths of opacuna, as they call them. They did wash themselves in water to cleanse themselves from sin. End quote. From Bible Myths, page 323. The Reverend Acosta seemed to marvel at these things, and, as if to account for their presence among the Indians, as he calls them, gives it as his opinion that Satan usurped these things and gave them to the natives for his service, as he wished to be worshipped with the things which were used in the worship of God. Bible Myths, page 404. His opinion is just so much nonsense and was intended for his ignorant and superstitious followers of that age. They also found that the natives had the doctrine of the Trinity from the Irish sun worship. One of the Mexican divinities was Tlaloc, from Tlaloc, the Irish sun god. The names of the persons of the Trinity are easily recognized even in this our day as Irish names of the sun god, namely Izona, Iasona, Bechob, the genitive Baal, and Ichia, which is but a variant of Iach, the sun god, with an ending added to it to formulate a name. And with all this we find that the Mayas of Central America worshipped the Irish sun god Kukulkan, Kukulcan, taken from the Irish Cuchulainn, Cuculan. Can all this be attributed to mere accidental coincidence, or can any of these be called an isolated fact? No, they belong to a series of facts constituting a mass of evidence which establishes beyond all doubt the racial identity of the authors of our ancient American civilization. It has just been announced, April 19, 1923, that in the ruins of the city of Chichen Itza there has been discovered the statue of 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀, the famous tiger king of the ancient Mayas. This is none other than a statue of the personified sun god, still bearing his ideal mythic title of 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀, from the Irish 𝗁c, each, every, all, the whole, universal. As IESA is the personal savior of each and every man, he is also the universal savior of all. And miol, an animal, any animal, is an ideal term which the ancient Irish priests applied to the sun. 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀 is called the Tiger King because of the fact that the tiger, or jaguar, a fierce native animal, is king of the jungle of Yucatan. This is after the Irish ideal in our Bible, that the sun is the heavenly lion, and the earthly lion is the king of the animal world. It is from this ideal that we get the term Lion of the Fold of Judah. What stronger proof could be adduced or wished for with which to confound the falsifiers of history, Roman or British, and those who follow their lead? In the press news of the day is published the opinion of an archaeologist that the date of the structure of the vast architectural remains of Chichen Itza goes back to the 7th century AD. Such an opinion will bear revision in view of the convincing evidence of a vastly greater antiquity. Where, we may ask, can it be shown that any other such like structures have been built in any part of the world since the 7th century, or within even the period so-called of the Christian era? No, those buildings are many thousands of years older than some would have us believe. The cross and the crucifix are specially and peculiarly identified with the ancient Aryan sun worship and Christian church of IESA Christ. They are symbolic of the crucified sun in the heavens and of his human counterpart, his spirit in man, in the flesh. This identification of those symbols with the ancient Irish, who were the original missionary race of the world, makes it easy to understand why there is such a similarity in the names of the Hindu savior Krishna and the Christian savior Christ. They are all one and the same and came from the same source. And this explains also why Brahmanism, Buddhism, and Christianity so nearly resemble each other. They are all due to those missionaries of the Irish First Church of Christ. It has always been a puzzle to honest investigators to account for this striking resemblance. If the exploits or past history of the ancient Irish people were chronicled in our histories, there would have been no difficulty whatever in accounting for those facts. The same policy of destruction, suppression, and alteration which was pursued in Ireland by Rome, she also put into execution on this western continent. In Mexico, as elsewhere, anything that was found resembling Christianity was destroyed, if it was possible to do so. The Roman priests destroyed all the books they could find, and those they preserved, they altered. They deleted whole chapters from the writings of the native historians who wrote the history of Mexico, from Bible Myths, page 199. Everything written by the natives was subject to an inquisition of the Spanish priests. But despite all the destruction of literature and monuments by the Spaniards and others, there is enough left to fully prove the connection between the Irish or Aryans and the discovery and settlement of this western continent. There is a tradition among the natives of Central America that the first of their people came from over the sea to the eastward, and were white men and bearded, and the beard has been proverbially worn by the ancient Irish, and they are so portrayed to us. And what is more, it has been found that one of the oldest of the Maya races, the 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗀, after the lapse of many thousands of years, has in its language many words of the same meaning and almost identical with Hebrew. This is according to a Mexican scholar, Sir Melgar, in North Americans of Antiquity, page 475, quoted in Donnelly's Atlantis, page 234. He has compiled a list of words of both languages which bears out his contention, and it has been shown, according to Donnelly, that there is a similarity between the Maya and the Phoenician alphabets, which is not surprising in view of all the facts. When we consider that the Irish were the Phoenicians, and also, as we have shown, that the Hebrews were the priestly cult among the Irish race, it makes very plain the identity of these three peoples as being one and the same. Investigators have noted the relationship between the Hebrews and the Phoenicians, attributing it to the spread of Hebrew culture and influence among the latter. This seems to be as far as they have been able to go toward enlightening us. They have left us to infer that this connection was due to the two peoples occupying two adjoining sections of country, the Hebrews occupying the interior pastoral country and the Phoenicians the sea coast. Those investigators seem to have accepted the false story of history at its face value and to have drawn their inferences accordingly. The Phoenicians and the Hebrews were one and the same race, as much so as two brothers living in the same household, or father and son in the same family. These are but trick names for the Irish race. Ireland was their seat, capital, and home country, not the eastern coast of the Mediterranean or Syria. This exposes a major deception of history and surely will help to give a clearer perspective of the past and a quickened realization of the fraud which has been imposed upon us. This deception has caused no end of confusion among scholars and investigators, but the announcement of the identity of those three races as being one is a fact, given out in these pages for the first time with a positive assurance of truth. The disclosures made here will be of aid to future investigators and philologists in tracing and accounting for the changes which have been made in the three alphabets said to have belonged, respectively, to the Irish, Hebrews, and Phoenicians. They are but variations of the one. We have good reason to believe, and it has been so stated, that there have been changes made in the Irish alphabet since the advent of the Latin influence of Rome into Ireland. The research work and explorations which have been made, with the excavations now going on, at the immense ruins in Mexico and Central America, if properly appraised by unbiased and capable investigators, will without a doubt correspond with the facts set forth in these pages. The very character and nature of these ruins, pyramids, sphinx, and temples at Palenque near the city of Mexico, and at Uxmal and Chichen Itza in Yucatan, and others elsewhere in America, are sufficient evidence to establish the authorship of those vast, impressive, and inspiringly instructive remains. Those first religious rites and ceremonies which were found here by the Spaniards are peculiarly of Irish origin and have been identified with their early Christian sun worship from the most ancient times. The Irish were the inspired authors of Christianity, which is plainly evident from what has been unfolded herein, and their rites are still observed in the disguised Christian sun worship of the present day. It all goes to show that there has been a deception practiced on the Christian people of the world, a terrible and a cruel deception. The reason for it is no longer a secret. And while those early masters who formulated those rites, and as well the ethical and spiritual principles which we find embodied in the myths and allegories of our Bible, were born as Irishmen of the Irish race, they were really for the world at large. They labored for all humanity. They carried the divine message of God's truth and the brotherhood of man around the world, east and west, north and south, and gave freely to such as were able to receive. To those great teachers we are indebted for our culture. We owe more to them than to any other. They cannot and they must not be denied this acknowledgement. Their works are spread throughout the world and bear a correspondence that is unmistakable. They built on so grand and imposing a scale as to proclaim to us of today their fidelity and loyalty to their exemplar and ideal Savior, the Sun God, whom they conceived as the Logos and Creator of all. And in honor of him, for his glorification and worship, they built those great and magnificent pyramids, towers, obelisks, sphinx, and temples. In brief, their works and ideals can be recognized everywhere, from the rock-walled temple ruins of the Angkor Wat in distant Cambodia to Siam, from Ellora and the cave temple of Elephanta in India to the islands of the Pacific, from Ireland to Egypt, from Syria to Peru, Yucatan, and Mexico. The character of their works cannot be mistaken. These facts are so clear that they cannot be mistaken or set aside. They are convincing and positive proofs. They proclaim to the world that both the religious institutions and the civilization which existed on this western continent for thousands of years were brought here by the priests of the ancient Irish sun worship and religion of IESA, the sun god. Chapter 12. The Going into Egypt. The Aryan Brotherhood of Magian adepts of ancient era was made up of advanced souls who were selected to be the elder brothers and instructors of the infant or backward races of mankind in a very early period, comparatively speaking, of human habitation in this round of evolution on this earth. They were incarnated into bodies or born again into the flesh to serve as guides and teachers for the new and unevolved souls who were not far enough advanced at the expiration of the previous round of planetary existence to avoid rebirth. These new souls were reincarnated here for the purpose of going through a vast series of incarnations which are necessary to the development and growth of body, soul, or mind and spirit power to attain perfection. The number of incarnations varies with each individual according to his progress towards spiritual perfection and the complete and final eradication of all earthly desires from his nature. This brotherhood of adepts were domiciled in Era for many thousands of years, during which time they explored nature in all its manifold and various aspects, both from within and without. It was here that they developed and acquired the vast and wonderful knowledge and science as demonstrated in the construction of the Great Pyramid of IESA, which has been the marvel of all ages since. They not only acquired a knowledge of physical nature, but also gained a knowledge and mastery of the spiritual and godlike powers within themselves, which are latent in every man, and became the true magicians of which both history and tradition tell us. The evidence that Ireland is the original home of the Aryan race and the island in which the Magian priesthood rose is overwhelming. All signs point to this country to confirm this fact. Ignatius Donnelly, in his work Atlantis, has produced a massive evidence to bear out this point, although he is laboring while doing so with the idea of trying to prove the one-time existence of the lost continent of Atlantis as described by Plato. He accepted Plato's story at its face value, not realizing that this story was but a fable invented by the priests who have written Plato's works, and intended this story to serve as an historical drop curtain on the stage of Ireland's great career. The story was invented to veil her past and to place her in oblivion at the bottom of the quote-unquote Atlantic Ocean. Donnelly was thoroughly convinced withal that the East or Asia was not the home of the Aryan race, and it is to be regretted that he did not become aware of the deception, as well as of the plot which inspired it, so that he could knowingly have refuted the propagandists who have been writing spurious history and have applied his logic and facts to Era instead of to the fictitious Atlantis. He quotes F. Pezron in his Antiquities of the Celtae, who shows that the Celtae were the same as the Titans, the giant race who rebelled in Atlantis, and, quote, that their princes were the same with the giants of Scripture, end quote. This is clear enough to be easily understood by anyone who has not been blinded by fiction. We can see here preserved in the mythic story of the Titans an allusion to Era's great Magian cult. He says further that the same author states that the word Titan, quote, is perfect Celtic and comes from tit, the earth, and ten or den, man, end quote. We can verify the truthfulness of this definition of the word Titan. It is correct and most suggestive and pronounced in what it reveals to us. It is further corroborative evidence pointing unmistakably to Ireland as the homeland of the Scriptures and the seat of the great Magi and of the ancient spiritual culture and civilization. From this center they spread their culture to the ends of the earth. In the first wave of their advance they gave Taoism, the Way, a monastic order, and a later wave gave China Fo, one of the Irish names of the sun god. He still shines on the hills of Han. They followed the sun around the earth and preached the gospel of light and life, everlasting and continuous to the whole world, the gospel of IESA, now called Jesus Christ. It was the seed they sowed that leavened the whole lump. And it is this very fact which is confirmed by the words attributed to the bogus Roman character St. Paul, though he remains silent as to who accomplished this arduous and wonderful missionary work, which was performed thousands of years before this mythical personage, Paul, the Spirit in the flesh, was formulated by the priggish priests of the Roman Church. It is quite obvious that Paul, or his supposed apostolic associates, in the few short years of their ministry, or their whole lifetime for that matter, could not have done this work. He is made to say in the epistle to the Colossians, quote, for the hope which is up for you in heaven, whereof ye heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel which is come unto you, as it is in all the world, end quote. Chapter 1, 5-6. The falsifiers of history have endeavored to show that the Aryan race originated or developed in Asia. This is plainly a trumped-up theory. We will let Mr. Donnelly speak on this point. He says, quote, but we have seen that in the earliest ages before the first Armenian migration of the historical Aryans, a people went from Iberian Spain and settled in Ireland, and the language of this people, it is now admitted, is Aryan. And these Iberians were originally, according to tradition, from the west. Atlantis, page 457. That is, from Era, which lies in the ocean to the west of Europe, as the Irish brought their colonies and culture to Iberia, and not Iberia to Ireland, as we've been told. Mr. Donnelly, in pursuing his inquiries, further says, quote, where, we ask, could this ancient nation, which existed before Greek was Greek, Celt was Celt, Hindu was Hindu, or Goth was Goth, have been located? The common opinion says in Armenia or Bactria in Asia. But where in Asia could they have found a country so peaceful as to know no terms for war or bloodshed? The name of the elephant, the beast with a hand, occurs only twice in the Rig Veda. A singular omission if the Aryans were from time immemorial an Asiatic race. And when it does occur, according to Whitney in his Oriental and Linguistic Studies, it is in such a way as to show that he was still an object of wonder and terror to them. End quote. Atlantis, pages 459-460. So, despite all the confusion of thought on this most important point caused by the aforesaid prevaricators of history, as to the original home of the Aryans, the truth has at last been clearly brought out. And so it must not seem strange even to the average reader to think that the world could be for so long a time so beguiled. Our beliefs regarding objects or facts are oftentimes accepted by us unconsciously, without due process of reasoning, and in youth we form prejudices in the mind which later are difficult to eradicate and overcome. Writers and investigators are no different from others, and have to contend with these influences and overcome them if they wish to arrive at the truth. It was the result of long research which caused the author of Atlantis to abandon preconceived ideas and thus bring to his mind the conviction that the fathers of the Aryan race must have dwelt for many thousand years so completely protected from barbarians and wild beasts that they at last lost all memory of them and all words descriptive of them. And where could this have been possible save in some great long civilized land, surrounded by the sea and isolated from the attack of the savage tribes that occupied the rest of the world? And if such a great civilized nation had dwelt for centuries in Asia, Europe, or Africa, why have not their monuments long ago been discovered and identified? Where is the race? Who are their natural successors and who must have continued to live after them in that happy land where they knew no human and scarcely any animal enemies? Why would any people have altogether left such a home? Why, when their civilization had spread to the ends of the earth, did it cease to exist in the peaceful region where it originated? It is to be regretted that this great student and investigator, possessing a wonderful mind, and who had in his day a reputation both as a writer and scholar, did not have some inkling of the purpose and cause which produced such great changes in the homeland of the Aryan race, that its identity was no longer recognizable to his mental view. Had he known of the true cause which was back of the changes wrought, how well he could have pointed his inquiries direct to the successors of the Roman and allied marauders, the Danes and Norse, and the later British ally and spoliator who laid this Aryan motherland in ruins. However, his questions find an answer in these pages, a faint echo of the happy state which prevailed in Ara, and when she ruled the continents and the seas and carried her culture and her commerce to the ends of the earth, has come down to us as a tradition which has been commemorated in song by the poet Moore. The tradition takes the form of an incident wherein a gallant knight, who hears of a young lady proposing to make a journey alone through the island, offers his services as an escort. She declines his offer, relying upon the honor and uprightness of her countrymen to assure her safe journey unmolested through the island from end to end. The poet couches her refusal of Sir Knight in these words, quote, "Though they love woman and golden store, Erin's sons love honor and virtue more." End quote. The sentiment in this tradition, as expressed by Moore, has been attributed by some as merely due to the love of chivalry of the ancient Irish. No, this does not rightly express it. It was all that and something else besides. It rested upon a basis of high ethical and spiritual culture. Among them, woman was respected, honored, and exalted. It finds expression in the feminine name applied to Era by an ancient poet. Her name was Banba, the good mother, but her right name was Ator. Ator means the ether, the primordial substance. They raised woman to her true position as counselor and equal. They idealized and glorified the feminine principle in such manner that the standard they set has been a model for other nations since their day. Metaphorically and mystically, they made her mother of God, queen of heaven, co-equal with the Father. Some would have us believe that it was in Persia that the Magi developed and that it was Turanian instead of Celtic. That is easily shown to be false from the fact that the Persians got the very name of their supreme deity, 𝗁𝗏𝗃𝗃, from the Irish Magi who first introduced light and knowledge into Persia. If the Magi had developed in Persia, they would not have had to borrow term or name in which to express him from another cult or people. The name is Irish or Celtic, but is slightly modified. Zur is from the Irish sor, S-O-R, meaning bright. Ane, A-N-E, means a circle, hence the sun, the bright sun. Acherin is from the Celtic Geran, meaning black or dark. The supreme god of the Persians then expresses the two opposites, or the active and passive principles in nature, and is the god of light and darkness, implying the sun god. This is in keeping with the Irish Magian idea, as one of their titles of the sun god, which has come to us, was Tailak or Dalak, the two stones, the sexes, the two opposites, light and darkness, the active and passive principles in nature. The Persian Zoroaster lit his torch at an Irish fane, for the very name also bespeaks its origin. Zor is but a variant of Sor, bright, and Aster is from the Irish Eosar, God, the bright God, the sun god. So Zoroaster is the sun god personified and is meant for the archimagus or the high hierophant of the sun worship. During their stay in Era, the Magi developed and instructed those whom they selected to add to their number in order to form a body numerous enough to spread light and civilization to distant parts, to be sent out as missionaries and colonizers to the various other countries. Here on this island, secluded from the rest of the world at that time, they developed and maintained vast religious communities which eventually took tribal form. And here was where the patriarchal form of government first arose. And here was the scene of the incidents commemorated in the Bible story written by the inspired Magi, in which were set down the precepts of the law as well as the stories told in allegorical and mythic form of incidents and human experiences gleaned within the precincts of 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝗃, the island of wisdom, the sacred isle of the ancient Magi of IESA, but not of Rome. Strange as it may seem to the uninitiated of all lands, here was where those who are referred to as the Hebrew cult lived and developed the arts and sciences which they spread throughout the ancient world from this their homeland. It was this order of priesthood who are secretly alluded to as the so-called Hebrew or Jewish race. There never was another, for it is a gross misnomer to apply it to the modern Jew, so-called, whose race has simply been made the victim of a heartless and cruel persecution in order to serve the purpose of Roman fraud. Any person who will study the Irish language or investigate the Irish tribal system and traditions and the institutions of the Druids will recognize it at once. The mantle of this great priesthood is so unique that it cannot successfully be made to fit the shoulders of any other. These adepts knew the sun as their creator, the visible representative of the great invisible deity, their savior and their guide. They emulated him in almost every way and worshipped him knowingly and consciously, as the poor Christian of today is led to do unknowingly and unconsciously under the disguised name of the personified Jesus. When the time became propitious for them to begin their mission, they migrated to Egypt in sufficient numbers to take possession of that country. This fact is commemorated in the Bible myth of Jacob and his family going into Egypt, and in profane history, which is but a redressing of the biblical narrative for secular use. It is alluded to as the invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos, or shepherd kings. The name Hyksos is a disguised form of the Irish term 𝗃𝗄𝗃, which is also pronounced Hyggswas, meaning upper house and implying the rule of the Magian priesthood. It is in conformity with the system of deception persistently carried out by the British and Roman priesthood in submerging all that would identify the great Irish adepts with their wonderful achievements. Those priest kings were called shepherds in the sense that the people they ruled over were called flocks. In the narrative, Phoenician, their ruler, we are told, pastured his flocks around the base of the pyramid. That his flocks did not consist of sheep can easily be inferred from the quite obvious fact that the region surrounding the pyramid is a sandy desert and could not afford pasturage to grazing animals of any kind, either at that time or since. The ancient Irish priests constructed their mythology in accordance with the spiritual facts in life and in nature. They personified and gave human form to ideas and vitalized them so that they seemed like real characters. The later order of priests who have succeeded them adopted a similar method to set forth their fables, which have been taken as facts and accepted unquestioningly. Such is the story of Joseph, whose brethren sold him as a slave into Egypt. Joseph, in this incident of the Bible myth, represents the spiritual man, ego or self, condemned to dwell in this earthly body. His brethren who sold him were his desires, which still clung to his lower nature and condemned him to come back from the world of spirit again to incarnate in a new body. This myth is true to nature and to fact, for man is a moral being and will be drawn back again, life after life, into the body and will suffer all the ills and trials of earthly existence until he resolves to conquer his desires or lower nature and live a strictly moral and spiritual life. It will be remembered that in the story, the brethren cast Joseph into a pit, which is but an allusion to rebirth in the body. The ancient Irish mythologists had the idea of the triune nature of man in mind when they likened the earth unto a woman and called her Mother Ceres, pronounced Ceres in Irish, a name which was later accredited to the goddess who was transferred to Greece by the plagiarists. In the myth, she was the spouse of the sun. She has been represented geographically by the three grand divisions of the ancient world according to the idea of the three principles of body, soul, and spirit. Africa, from the Irish a, fear, pronounced afar, a man, represents the body or sensual nature, seed, and generation. Asia, from 𝗃𝗁𝗄𝗃, passion, represents the principle of the soul or passional nature, growth and germination. Europe, from the Irish 𝗰𝗵, of the east or sun, figuratively the highest, the goddess, represents the spirit. The myth of Noah and his three sons also follows the threefold system, but it bears the plainest evidence of being altered by the English transcribers, for we find the English word 𝗵 introduced to serve as the name of one of the sons. The three sons are Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Ham, the hips, as the name literally means, represents Africa, the lower or sensual nature of man, generation. Shem, from the Irish Sam, Samhain, and Shemos, the sun, represents Asia or the navel, which is said to be the region of the passional nature, germination. Japhet, from Iao, Yah, changed by using the letter J instead of I into Yah, whence we get Jah, Javeh, Yahweh, Jehovah, Japhet, represents Europe, the head, spirit, or higher nature of man. The word Africa implies inconstancy. The word is formed from two Irish words, a, fear, letter A, space, F-E-A-R, a man, and fracas, F-R-A-C-A, sport or debauch, as a fear fracas is considered an inconstant man, sensuality. It is amazing to consider the time and energy expended by many earnest men in trying to connote facts and connect the various and fictitious Hamitic, Shemitic, and Japhetic races of men. Investigators have been following a false scent, and it would have been almost as fruitful for them to have been searching for any other imaginary races, as the Porpoteries or the Hydandarenes, for instance. In the myth as set forth, Africa represents the hips or generative principle. The word Egypt itself represents the flesh or sex, the mother principle or birth in the body. The name is a formulated one. It is formed from the Irish word ig, I-G-H, Greece, the flesh or body, and ege, E-I-G-E, a web or womb, also egak, clamorous, desire, hence the Irish name Egypt, E-I-G-H-I-P-T. It is presented to us in disguised form as Egypt, implying birth in the body. In both Irish myth and story, suggestive and often direct and plain language is used, and the Bible itself, being an Irish book originally, is proof of it. As the sun was said to go down into a cave in the west at night in the ocean to his daily death, his spirit in man also descends into the cave of the body at generation and birth, where it is said to be dead. It is said that the body is death to the spirit, as when bodily desires are rampant and awake, spiritual ones are dormant. The more we are absorbed in the things of the body and of the world on this material plane, the less we are in the things of the spirit. This truth is embodied in the pyramid itself. It is greater in bulk at the base where it has contact with the earth than at any other point. As the higher it ascends and recedes from the earth, the less body it has until it terminates at the point, symbolically, where matter ends and spirit begins. Chapter 13. The Four Pyramid Group and Sphinx, designed and erected to symbolize man. The Great Pyramid of IESA is one of a group of four, namely IESA the largest, CHEFREN the second in size, MYCERENES the third in size, and ASYCUS the least and lowest of the group. This group with the Great Sphinx forms the most important and significant group of symbols ever erected by the hand of man. The complex nature of man has been set forth under a various enumeration or system of set principles by different schools of thought, such as the threefold, fourfold, and sevenfold principles of man. This group of pyramids represents the fourfold system and, as symbolized by those monuments, is inclusive of the others. The Magian Grand Architect built in accordance with this fourfold idea, which is also embodied in mythical and cryptic language in the Bible, and again gives additional proof as to its origin and authorship by the inspired Irish Magian adepts, who built for all time on a true foundation. Under this fourfold system, the body is divided into four regions or centers, namely the region of the head, the heart, the navel or bowels, and the genitals, each center being the seat of the active principles as comprehended in this fourfold summary of man's nature. The theory which is most entertained is that the pyramids in general, and more particularly the group of four which symbolizes this fourfold summary of man's composition and qualities, were built as tombs for the kings who are said to have built them and whose names they are said to bear. Most of our modern paragraphers and writers have advanced this idea. The formulated names of the four pyramids were said to be the names of men who were rulers and members of a dynasty who ruled over Egypt in successive order, as follows: Cheops, his brother CHEFREN, MYCERENES, and ASYCUS. Cheops is said to have been possessed of the desire to build himself a great monument which would immortalize his name, a monument which would serve as a fit tomb for his body. His brother CHEFREN was reputed to have a similar ambition to erect a monument and tomb that would rival that of his brother. MYCERENES, the son of Cheops, is said to have been equally desirous of duplicating or surpassing the example set by his predecessors, father and uncle, and erect a monument and tomb for himself. And ASYCUS also, we are told, was ambitious to even excel all the others and erect an enduring monument and tomb to perpetuate his memory. The historical authenticity of this dynastic family of kingly personages has been generally accepted until now. My discoveries prove them to be allegorical and fictitious, and will destroy this fiction, and substitute therefore the sublime and valuable truths which are secretly embodied in the names of those four pyramids. The explanation of the symbol of the Great Sphinx will also throw additional light on the purpose which inspired the erection of those gigantic monuments and the truths which they were so faithfully intended to convey to the initiated, and destined henceforth, we believe, to be a perpetual reminder to man of what he now is and what he is ultimately to become, one in union of spirit with the sun god IESA, the Creator. Chapter 14. The Mystery of the Sphinx, the Problem Solved. From the very remote age in which this strange and peculiar monument was erected as a companion symbol to the Great Pyramid of IESA, it is mystified, reflecting mankind. Outside the ranks of the comparatively few who were chosen for initiation into the mystery rites of the Great Pyramid Temple, there was no knowledge extant among the great mass of mankind regarding the significance of this strange, odd, and withal uncanny piece of architecture. This ignorance of its significance and of the reason for its being has continued among men down to this present day. The questions which came before the minds of the men of the past ages, no less than those which come before the minds of the men of our time, were: why was this structure built? Who erected it? And what does it represent? What sort of minds could men be possessed of who could have expended such a vast amount of time and energy in designing and erecting such an apparently fantastic creation in stone in the midst of the solitary desolation of the sandy desert? What use or purpose could it fulfill? No solution has come down through all the ages since that far-off time that would satisfy those earnest and longing inquiries. Until now, an atmosphere of awe and mystery was purposely cultivated and spread abroad among the populace, which had the effect of making it next to impossible to arrive at a true and real understanding of the creation and meaning of the great Sphinx. Fables were invented and circulated concerning it. The people were led to believe that this curious structure represented a monster that was but a type of a race of beings which formerly inhabited the earth, but which was now extinct. One of the regular and particular purposes for which we are told it was erected was to function as an official quarters for the use of the Pythoness or seeress, from which to give forth her oracles, and that her aid and offices were sought by the people in solving the problems of daily life, which were too intricate for themselves to solve, or to gratify the curious or the mystical who desired to pry into the future. Hence the legend of consulting the Sphinx, which has come down to us from very early times, though long subsequent to its erection by the Magi. For consulting the seeress is an institution or practice which, in general, has survived from a very hoary antiquity. Its character varies in degree, but in general it was practiced by the unregenerate. There are traces of it yet visible in our own day. For this purpose there was a special room set apart by the priests, and from this niche or chamber, called the adytum, she gave forth her predictions or oracles. The mystification of the ancient populaces alone has not been the only effect of ignorance of the true nature and purpose of the great Sphinx, but it has also served to keep modern mankind in ignorance and darkness as well. One of the fabulous stories told, which has served to keep an air of mystery about the great Sphinx, is that the oracle propounded an enigma which no one was able to solve. She asked, quote, "What animal is it that in its infancy walked on 4 legs, and in its adolescent state walked on 2 legs, and in its old age walked on 3 legs?" End quote. No one could solve the problem, we are told, until Oedipus, the priest, came along and made answer that the animal was man, who walked on all 4s in his infancy, and on 2 legs in his adolescence, and with the aid of a cane walked on 3 legs in his old age. Whereupon, we are told, in a rage, the oracle flung herself on the rocks and was dashed to death. The use of this great Sphinx was but a minor one, and when it was inaugurated was for the purpose of interesting and holding the multitude in subjection. The primal cause and reason for the erection of this most unique structure, with the head of a woman and the body of a lion, was to fulfill the design of the great Irish adept architect to form an indispensable and integral part in the Great Pyramid's symbolic group, and serve as a most fitting symbol of man. He is here represented in his twofold aspect, the upper part representing the human soul nature, and the lower part the animal nature and qualities in his being. In a most true and fitting sense, then, the Great Sphinx was designed to symbolize the unregenerate man, who has as yet two aspects only, soul and animal nature. He has not yet become spiritual, spirit being the third aspect in man's triune nature. This explains why the head of the Great Sphinx is that of a woman, for the reason that the soul is said to be feminine. So this most impressive symbol is fittingly grouped and connected with the plan and purpose of the pyramidal monuments, and stands in direct contrast with the Great Pyramid of IESA, which represents spirit. In one aspect, the Great Sphinx represents the neophyte, or in modern phraseology, the candidate who is to be inducted into the occult mysteries of the Great Pyramid Temple, wherein wisdom would be received which would enable him to liberate himself from his lower or animal and build up his spiritual body or nature. The location in the desert made a fit and appropriate setting for those wonderfully expressive symbols, and in accord with the esoteric or hidden truths embodied in them, as it was held that the world itself, or this material plane, is a desert to the spirit. And this brings home to us an appreciation of the great wisdom of that school of Irish adept masters who were the first to discover and explore the profound depths of man's inner nature. They were the first Freemasons, from Phre, Phre, the sun. And it was in Ireland that Freemasonry first began, came into flower, and from there spread throughout the entire world. Ireland was the country par excellence and the original homeland of Freemasonry. The low plane to which it fell in England under the sway of the bishops may be estimated from the fact that it became associated with the coarse revelry of the alehouse and tavern. For modern Freemasonry is historically said to have had its birth in the Apple Tree Tavern in London in the year 1717. This fact reflects the very low moral status of the people of England under the care, or rather lack of it, of a self-indulgent clergy. It is all too suggestive of the carousals of the inn, where the piper played vulgar tunes such as the alehouse keeper in great glee, the banks of Claudy, Jack and his bottle of punch, and the bonny Highland laddie. In every age, poets, philosophers, and sages have sung paeans of praise to Masonry, but not from a tavern. To say the least, it was not an ideal setting for Masonry. The atmosphere of the tavern is not suitable to the temple or to higher aspirations. Well may men exclaim, "O era, to what depths has thy bright flame fallen through the baseness and rapacity of those who envied thy glory and coveted thy possessions! They extinguished thy light without themselves possessing it." Freemasons have accepted much for granted. In this respect, they do not differ from the generality of men. Freemasonry has lost many of its ancient landmarks, and its lights have been dimmed through the influence of the bishops, who have made it subordinate to the creeds. Metaphorically speaking, the Christian creeds are but rivulets from the well, flowing through and polluted by the alluvial soil of human misconceptions. Ancient Freemasonry was the clear well of wisdom which tradition tells us was geographically situated in Midian, not the fictitious so-called Media of the priest-scribes, but what was anciently the province, now the county, of Meath in Ireland, where was situated Saescan, the seat of wisdom, at Tara. If Masonry has become materialistic or narrow and has lost her soul through the influence of priests and prelates who have obscured her light, she yet shall find it and be restored to her former glorified estate. She shall become again the bright, resplendent, and adorable, the great mother of all living. The paucity of knowledge among men regarding the significance of these great emblems has found expression in a phrase which has become an aphorism, to wit, quote, "as meaningless as the pyramids and the Sphinx." End quote. The truths which are herein unfolded leave no further use for such a phrase, and as a comparative expression of speech, it henceforth becomes redundant. For those venerable monuments once more become alive with meaning and bespeak to all men their inspired message, and as time progresses, they will increase as objects of fervid interest and elicit more and more the wonder and admiration of mankind for the truths they embody and for the great master adepts who in this manner memorialized them. In its ancient perfect state, the unique structure of the great Sphinx had an outer covering of white stone and was crowned with a silver headpiece to symbolize the imperishable nature of the soul and to reflect back those streaming rays which it received from the Lord IESA, the heavenly sun, or sun, S-O-N. Chapter 15. The Pyramid of ASYCUS. Backward or undeveloped man, born into the body or flesh in the physical world, is engrossed in his animal nature, sensuality, and it may be said that the generality of mankind, even today, although the race has advanced somewhat on the upward trend, are still more or less enchained by their gross sensual nature. Therefore, in accordance with this fact in man's nature, the pyramid of ASYCUS represents the lower principles or the sensual nature in man, seed and generation. The true definition of the word pyramid will of itself at once suggest this meaning. The derivation of the word has been sought for by many writers and investigators without success. They have sought for it in the Greek, Arabic, Coptic, Latin, Spanish, and French languages, but they've never ventured to search for it at its true source. Dr. Sayce, in his pyramid work, A Miracle in Stone, on page 46, cites 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀 as authority that it is a Coptic word meaning a division of 10, from pyr, P-Y-R, meaning division, and met, meaning 10. However this may be, in so far as the meaning of the Coptic words pyr and met are concerned, they are not germane to the idea or sense embodied either in the word pyramid or in the symbol itself. That it is not the true derivation of the word will be seen. The word pyramid has a true and faithful correspondence and relationship to what has already been explained regarding the lower principle of man's nature. In this word we again discover the fine hand of the clerical doctor at work to obscure the origin and authorship and meaning of these grand and venerable symbols. The word pyramid is formed from the Irish word peir, P-E-I-R, meaning the buttocks or hips, and the English word amid, meaning literally the middle of the hips or buttocks. The phallus, or organ of sex, and by changing the form of the word for deceptive purposes, they have made it pyramid. A great many investigators have been deceived by such trickery, but the truth will prevail in the end. It is this very idea of the besetting sin through man's lower nature which is in the mind of the prophet Isaiah, prophet of the Irish sun god IESA, when he says, quote, "So shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians prisoners, and the Ethiopians captives, young and old, naked and barefoot, even with their buttocks uncovered, to the shame of the Egyptians." End quote. Isaiah 22:4. To amplify this truth, if we do not suppress and conquer our desires, they will master and rule us and become our kings. Unless we overcome, we shall be in bondage to our ruling desire. This is plainly set forth in the words of Isaiah, quote, "And the inhabitants of this isle shall say in that day, Behold, such is our expectation, whither we flee for help, to be delivered from the king of Assyria, and how shall we escape?" End quote. Isaiah 20:6. In the ideology of the ancient Irish, the ass typified the animal nature or unspiritual man, and recognizing the fact that all men are not equally evolved and occupying the same level in spiritual progress, The white she-ass typified the man not possessed of spiritual knowledge, but capable of acquiring it. The very name ASYCUS itself suggests that this pyramid is called after the ass and was intended to symbolize this animal or unspiritual quality in man, which he must eradicate from his nature. It is plainly the burden of Isaiah's thoughts. Quote, that I will break the Assyrians in my land, and upon my mountains tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. This is the purpose that is proposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all the nations. Isaiah 14:25 and 26. In the title of this pyramid, we have a formulated name composed of the Irish word asal, or the English word ass, with the Greek ending, hence ASYCUS. This pyramid is built of coarse brick of a brownish or dull yellowish hue, said to correspond in the astral world of colors to the auric shade or hues emanating from the sensual man. Thoughts and emotions have color, and in the astral world a man's status spiritually is cognized by the colors radiating from him. The nerve center in the forehead, from which emanates the auric light in colors, indicates one's status on the astral plane. Quote, if the light radiating from it is golden yellow, it is the name of the sun. If dull red or green, it is the brand of the beast. End quote. Apocalypse Unsealed by John M. Price, pages 109 through 110. It is this fact in man's nature which forms the basis for the Christian being told, without any explanation being given to him, that his sins are written upon his forehead. In the astral or the higher spiritual planes of nature, the disembodied soul goes to the plane corresponding to its condition, and this can even be much more easily perceived than a man's color can be distinguished on his physical plane, as to whether he is white or black, red or yellow. So it is a fact in nature that the plane in the astral or lower spiritual world on which the soul exists immediately after leaving the body is determined by the life it lived while in the body. If it is foul from evil thoughts and deeds, it will go to a low plane, corresponding to its condition, where suffering and purification take place before it can ascend to a higher plane. The pyramid of ASYCUS was a constant reminder to the instructed of these important truths, that he might exercise his will to control his thoughts and reflect on the enormity as well as on the penalty of transgressing the good or moral law. Chapter 16. The Pyramid of MYCERENES. This pyramid represents the passional and desire principle in man. Physically, it represents the navel or bowels, the region of the body which is said to be the seat of the passional or desire nature. MYCERENES is a name which has been formulated to embody the idea of the destructive force and effect of the emotions, appetites, passions, and desires upon the spiritual efforts of man to build up the spiritual fabric of his being by conquering his lower nature. The passional nature is tenacious, and the desires are clamorous to assert themselves. They are forever gnawing, as it were, to eat away and destroy as fast as he builds up. And it is only by consciously suppressing them and keeping them in abeyance until he is finally able to eradicate them from his nature that spirituality is attained. This pyramid symbolizes this fact in man's being. That such a fact is a part of man's nature becomes very plain to us when we understand that in the long ages of the past, the soul or personality of man has evolved through the animal kingdom, and he retains more or less strongly yet the traits and tendencies of the animal nature in his personality, such as anger, selfishness, jealousy, etc. This fact is embodied in the Bible myth of the ark, for man himself is the ark into which went a pair, male and female, of the animals of every living species. So the name of this pyramid has been invented to secretly embody this principle or truth. It is a most suggestive name when once it is explained. It suggests that the mice are in us. Mice and moles gnaw and burrow and often destroy the work of man on the material plane. The animal passions, emotions, appetites, and desires of man gnaw and destroy and defeat his efforts to build up his spiritual or solar body. They interfere with and prevent the perfecting work of man if they are not suppressed and overcome. This truth is embodied in the allegorical description of the building of the walls of Jerusalem. This city represents the spiritual body of man, or the heavenly city, which is within himself. The building of this spiritual city or body is the burden of Nehemiah's theme. The characters Sanballat and Tobiah, introduced in the story, are merely derogatory epithets, personified and applied to traits and tendencies in the man who is identified with his sensual nature. And the Arabians and Ammonites, wandering peoples of the desert of low and thieving proclivities, are introduced to represent these lower qualities in man. This allusion made here will be found in the 4th chapter and 7th verse, which is as follows, quote, "But it came to pass that when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, then they were wroth." End quote. This will make the meaning very clear when the name Ashdodites is defined. It signifies the singed, from the Irish word dodhe, D-O-D-H-E, meaning burned, those who burn with desire, the evildoers, the sensual. And as these characters and peoples represent the lower and destructive qualities in our nature, it will be very easy to understand the meaning of the 8th or following verse in the same chapter, which is as follows, quote, "And conspired all of them together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it." End quote. Nehemiah 4, chapter 8. These elements in our nature we must overcome if we would escape from the wheel of death and rebirth. It is the goal of man to achieve liberation from his lower nature, and it is an individual task for each and every human being to accomplish. That it is an arduous task may be gleaned from the great Magian truth which has been preserved in the book of Proverbs, without a note of acknowledgement by our commentators to the great adepts who were the first to discover man's secret inner nature. Quote, "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city." End quote. Proverbs 16:32. Hence, the pyramid MYCERENES was erected to be a constant reminder to man to conquer his passional nature. This pyramid, in its former perfect state, like the pyramids CHEFREN and IESA, was completely covered with an outside finishing layer of white limestone, which made it an impressive object under the bright glare of the Egyptian sun. Chapter 17. The Pyramid of CHEFREN. This pyramid represents physically the 3rd region of the body or heart, which is said to be the seat of a twofold principle in man, which is commonly called the soul. This consists of a higher and a lower principle. The former is lasting, the latter temporary and perishable. We will endeavor to show that this pyramid symbolizes this twofold principle of the soul, and that it was known to those who bestowed the name of CHEFREN upon it. This is a slightly camouflaged name and is a compound Irish word with a Greek ending. The Irish word for a disembodied soul, fairy, or aerial being is CHEFRE, and by dropping an E and substituting an N in the last syllable, they made it CHEFREN, which is the same as the Greek term phren, P-H-R-E-N, the lower mind or perishable principle of the soul. Apocalypse Unsealed, pages 14 and 54 by John M. Pryes. That the Irish Magian architect who designed and supervised the erection of this grand pyramid, almost equal in height to that of the Great Pyramid of IESA, understood this truth goes without saying. It was a part of the esoteric instruction which was given by them to the initiates of all the ancient priesthoods which they established in the various countries which they visited in their missionary pilgrimage. They also embodied this truth in our Irish Bible, which we have been falsely taught to believe a Syrian Jewish book. In order to grasp this truth of the dual nature of the soul more easily, I am writing for the average reader as well as for those who may be more advanced, let us bear in mind the neophyte who is striving to eradicate all the evil qualities and propensities from his nature and to build up his perfect spiritual or solar body. In doing this work, he arrives at an intermediate stage of spiritual growth, represented physically at the midriff, where he parts with his carnal or animal qualities, and which is symbolized by this pyramid. In the upward progress of man's spiritual development, it is the first of the four pyramids emblemizing the permanent or immortal elements in his nature. The lower qualities of the soul belong to the animal nature of man, and when he arrives at this stage of advancement, he has succeeded in separating himself from his lower principles. It is this truth which is embodied in the Bible myth of the half-tribe of Manasseh, which is but an allusion to the ego or self arriving at the state of consciousness where takes place the separation of his higher mind or qualities, which are permanent, from the lower mind or perishable qualities of the soul, which disintegrates in the lower psychic world. Manasseh is a name formed from the Irish word man, meon, manus, meaning mind. One of the Irish names of God is Man, M-A-N-N, the supreme mind. This truth is illustrated by Joseph, the advancing man who, in his upward progress at this stage in the Irish myth in our Bible, is called Manasseh, and at a higher stage is called Ephraim. These two characters are said to be brothers, which is merely a figure of speech in the allegory. In this story, we are told that Joseph, who is the ego or self, married the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On, the priest of the sun. In the metaphor of the allegory, the daughter signifies wisdom. So we see that Joseph obtained wisdom from the priest of the sun, which wisdom enabled him to create two sons, that is, to take two progressive steps higher towards the goal of final emancipation from the trammels of his earthly nature. This idea of the dual character of the soul, that no particle of the lower principles can attach to the higher or immortal soul, is set forth in the allegory in the second chapter of Nehemiah. In the story, Jerusalem represents the ideal holy city or perfect spiritual body, which the ego or self is building up. In the narrative, the ego or self in his progress or travels is reconnoitering the environs of Jerusalem, and the idea of this duality is secretly embodied thus, quote, "And I arose in the night, I and some few men with me, neither told I any man what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon." End quote. Nehemiah 2:12. The beast is his own animal nature. And again, quote, "Then I went on to the gate of the fountain and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass." End quote. Nehemiah 2:14. So these are the spiritual truths of the soul, which are symbolized by the pyramid of CHEFREN. This grand pyramid, before it was despoiled by zealous fanatics, had an outer casing of white limestone which glistened in the sunlight, in correspondence with the higher and immortal principle of the luminous soul which it emblemized. This pyramid was crowned with a silver capstone. Among the ancient Irish, silver was one of the precious metals sacred to the sun worship and dedicated to the goddess Luna, spouse of the sun, and typified the imperishable element of the soul. Chapter 18. The Great Pyramid of IESA. An axiom of the great Irish priesthood of the sun was that, as above, so below, but in inverse order, as for instance, what is divine love on the highest spiritual plane or the celestial world becomes carnal love here below on the physical plane. They knew by direct cognition the secrets of nature and recognized the fact that man was both spiritually and physically the child of the sun his father and of the earth his mother. They venerated all life and held it sacred. As the earth was the mother of all life and mankind her highest offspring, they found a correspondence or analogy between the earth and the human body. As man is born on this earth through the medium of sex, they formulated a correspondence of this idea of the sex principle, which is located in the center of the body, with Egypt, which is geographically situated likewise in the very center of the land surface of the globe. See The Pyramid of Giza, Jeeseh, by 𝗃𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀. And here in this very center of the earth's surface they erected an altar to God in the desert, on the bank of the river Nile, representing physically the phallus, which typified the creative power of the sun god. It also symbolized the Spirit of God and its regenerative power in man. It was erected to be an enduring temple, a symbol and a reminder to all solicitous and wayfaring men of the significant fact that, though it is through the medium of sex that we come into earthly being, it is only through self-denial and continence and the abnegation of sex desire that the soul of man can escape rebirth and achieve regeneration. This is the very idea embodied in the ancient Irish church service of the Mass, which has been adopted by Rome but never explained to the congregations which sit in her church pews. They are all unconscious of its true meaning and purport. Therefore, they cannot be a party to it. The word Mass is Irish and signifies the hips or buttocks. It is really the ancient service of the Irish celibate priesthood. It is called a sacrifice, or an offering of the Mass, that is, a promise to God to sacrifice and forego the wiles of the flesh or sex. A man cannot be wished or prayed into a spiritual state of perfection or into heaven by another. It is a task which he himself must knowingly and consciously strive for and achieve. A man ignorant of these truths never obtained liberation from the flesh, that is, never became perfect and entered the higher celestial heaven. It is needless to say that the great majority of mankind is not yet ready for this step. However, it is only by knowing this great truth and following it that they will be benefited. This very idea, which is secretly embodied in the ceremony of the Mass, bespeaks most eloquently the profound spiritual wisdom of the Irish adept masters. This is the great and living truth emblemized in the Great Pyramid of IESA, which was disfigured by the Roman cohorts when they undertook to destroy all the monuments and evidence of the elder Christian church, which would conflict with the false claims set up by the Roman Church adherents. This great pillar, which represented the Spirit of God in an unregenerated world and emblemized again a perfect world and a regenerated man, was defiled and desecrated, and a studied effort has ever since been made to keep the world in ignorance as to its real purpose and import, as to who its inspired builders were. That this great pyramid was designed to represent the Spirit in the purified or regenerated man can clearly be understood from its special and peculiar construction and the disguised and camouflaged names of Cheops and Giza or Giza, which have been given to it, with the idea that under these deceptive names the truth regarding it would never be suspected. In order to effect this deception, they invented the word Cheops as a name for the Great Pyramid by taking the Irish word spook, S-P-O-E-H-C, or spirit, which the Great Pyramid of IESA represents, and writing the word backwards. By this reversed form of spelling, they got the word Cheops, one of the names by which it has been designated in so-called history. The names Giza and Giza, which have also been applied to the Pillar of Fire, are obtained by spelling backwards the name Hezig and Hezij, which are but two forms of the word IESA. These names are obtained by the use of the aspirate H used in the Irish, thus IESA and Hezej, and by using the terminology zig to complete the word instead of the ending sa. All Celtic scholars will recognize this form of the word IESA, often carelessly pronounced as if written Iesig or Hesig. So this crime and carefully planned deception of destroying and defacing this magnificent temple erected to God by the master adepts of the ancient Irish Church is clearly shown, and credit for its erection was denied to the most advanced cult of men that the race has ever known. This is proved so clearly that no man, whatever may have been his preconceived ideas on the subject, can ever have a doubt henceforth, despite all the subterfuge employed and misinformation given out, that this grandest and most sublime of all earth's monuments was designed by and erected under the supervision of the Irish Magi, masters of the sacred science. Physico-spiritually, the Pyramid of IESA represents the region of the head, for here is located the brain, which is the seat of the rational intelligence. And also it contains the clusters or groups of nerve centers which, when aroused and vitalized by the perseverance and conscious effort of the aspirant, gives him light and wisdom, through the medium of which he finally attains to spiritual perfection, or arrives at the fullness of his godlike powers. These nerve centers in man, in which this spiritual potency is slumbering, are said to be dead or atrophied, such as the pineal gland back of the frontal bone of the forehead. This gland, when it is awakened, becomes the spiritual eye of the seer. It is called by writers of occult subjects the third eye and the unpaired eye. Through it, the seer or adept can exercise spiritual vision at will. It becomes to such a window into space through which he may, while yet in the body, cognize life and existence in the supernal spheres. He has access to all knowledge through the fullness of his spiritual powers. As the soul contains all knowledge, it but remains for him to make use of it in accordance with the divine plan which he cognizes. That the adept who built the Great Pyramid of IESA had reached this stage of wisdom goes without saying, as the most sacred verities in man's nature and attested in their Bible are faithfully embodied in these 4 pyramids. Those Irish masters possessed wisdom which they acquired through the development of their spiritual powers by secret means which they guarded securely and imparted only to those whom they considered worthy. This can be accepted as fact, and will be, by every student who has the least inkling of occult lore or experience. In what is called the Queen's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, Professor H.L. Smith of Hobart College, Geneva, New York, discovered evidence in a niche of that chamber which gave him, stubborn man of physical science and all that he was, a most profound surprise. He found 2 charts of the sidereal heavens traced in the walls of this niche in the Queen's Chamber. One of the charts represented the sidereal year of the heavens from the time that the pole star was last visible and in direct line from the shaft of the Great Pyramid through its opening on the north side, and the other chart was of the sidereal year preceding it. He took the trouble and labor to work out all the calculations in the problem before him to test the accuracy of those ancient charts of the heavens. he found them absolutely correct. According to Beckett, the Earth travels around the pole of the ecliptic in the period of 25,827 years. He found that the heavens were charted correctly for a period indicating more than 51,000 years. He evidently was amazed at discovering proof of such profound knowledge on the part of the builder. In a private letter, in speaking of the evidence he found there, Professor Smith says, quote, "Either there is proof in that chamber of supernatural inspiration granted to the architect, or that primeval official possessed, without inspiration in an age of absolute scientific ignorance 4,000 years ago, scientific knowledge equal to, if not surpassing, that of the present highly developed state of science in the modern world." End quote. L. McCarthy's Pyramid of Giza. As the burden and fruit of our Irish Bible myths is the production, conception, and birth of the perfect man-god from the earth-man or belly-man, Potiphar in the sacred myth, and Firbolg, belly-man or bag-man in the Irish profane history, so likewise is this same truth embodied in this symbolical four-pyramid group and sphinx, the highest and greatest of which typifies the ideal perfect man-god IESA, the glory of the ages and of all time. This correspondence between the Bible and those symbols is a most significant fact which cannot be overlooked or set aside. It only speaks in a more unmistakable manner of the perfidy of the two arch-conspirators to deny to Ireland the credit for the achievement of her men of genius. The same truth is preserved in the cryptic writings of the fabulous historian Diodorus Siculus, who tells us that Philetus erected the Great Pyramid. The name Phoenician is also applied to the builder of this pyramid. These are but two forms of the same word and are meant to distinguish the same person, the ego or self, at two different stages of spiritual growth. Philetus is the lower man, or as the name implies, the man of the blood, and at the beginning of his development. Phoenician, supposed to be a prince, is the same man who has reached the highest stage of spiritual development, or in other words, under the title of Phoenician, the ego or self is said to have erected the perfect pyramid of IESA, the symbol of the solar or spiritual body. The name Philetus is adapted from the Irish word fuil, F-U-I-L, the blood, but the spelling and form Philitis, P-H-I-L-I-T-I-S, obscures it just enough to deceive, which it was intended to do. As it is the lower man, yet tainted with the qualities inherent in the blood, who must make the beginning to live a better life and aspire to the things of the spirit, it is only natural to the system of the Irish myth-makers to give man, in this stage in the cryptic story, the name Philitis, F-I-L-I-T-I-S, but it was slightly changed for the purpose of obscuring it by their successors. Those names which are used to indicate supposedly historic personages by the priest scribes who have written those histories of the ancient past under fictitious names, such as Diodorus Siculus, etc., are simply formulated names composed to express the ideas which they wish to set forth, and are not the names of any particular individuals who had acted a part in life. They are mythical names and convey no idea of the sense of true history. Of such characters also are all the invented names of the ancient Egyptian dynasties which are mentioned in our histories, so far as any particular individual king is concerned. But all through the mythical story are preserved secretly allusions to facts which are contained in those names, and required only knowledge of the interpretive key to be understood. Whatever there was of real and actual history of mankind, chronicled up to the time of the destruction of the Alexandrian libraries, through the mad ambition of Rome to reduce the world to ignorance and to rule all mankind under her own church dominion, was destroyed. The other great libraries that remained were those in Ireland, which she destroyed at the time of the English invasion. At the time of the Spanish invasion of America, her priests destroyed all the literature which they could find, Any of it they spared, they altered to suit their purpose of deception. Wherever any writings could be found that would shed light on the past, they were seized and destroyed. It is only since the conquest of the Irish Church of IESA that the staffs of priests were set to work by Rome to compose histories which would furnish a proper setting or background for her false pretensions. At the time of the conquest of the Irish Church in papacy, she took over the Irish sacred writings and mythical lore, and our Bible is an eloquent witness to substantiate my statement. She has adopted them as her own and altered them to suit her claims. The evidence of the Irish occupation in Egypt is established by those great pyramids and other monuments and remains along the Nile Valley. This fact is amply borne out in secret in the mythical names given of temples and places and of Egypt's first ruler. We are told that the founder of the first colony in Egypt was Isis, and that she was worshipped there by her devotees and disciples. She is the ancient Irish goddess or mother of God, and the Irish introduced her worship there. At one time, her worship extended all over Europe. Mythically, she is the moon, and the night, the consort of the sun, and she is the ether, the primordial substance. Mythically, she is the queen of heaven and the mother of God, co-equal with the Father. The name is formed from the Irish 𝗃𝗃, I-S-E-ISIS, meaning she, herself, who, with T, T-I, he, himself, constitutes the co-equal Father, Mother, God. The dynasty of the Pharaohs is a mythical one, and is Irish lore preserved in the Bible. The name Pharaoh has a cryptic meaning and alludes to man's peculiar composition and tendencies. The pharaohs are invented rulers or personages formulated to express the idea of a stage in the allegorical story of man's generation in the fleshly body, which is a prelude to his progressive advance into the spiritual body. The name is composed of two words made into one, but slightly changed so that it might not be so easily discovered by those for whom it was not intended, that is, all outside the ranks of the priesthood. It is derived from the Irish words far, F-E-A-R, meaning man, and rove, R-A-O-D-H, meaning to ride, the sensual man. This is the leading sense meant to be conveyed by the term, and this idea is expressed in the myth, in the incident of Pharaoh's wife becoming enamored of Joseph. It also expresses the dual sex nature of man from the word raon, R-A-O-N, with the letter N omitted, meaning both, or the two sexes, for it is a fact in nature that man is double-sexed. While spirit is sexless, man born into the body is subject to the incident of being born either into a male or female body, according to the lessons or experience from which his soul or ego is destined to gain knowledge or wisdom in each particular incarnation, until the ego is through with the attractions of the earthly existence and completes the building of the spiritual body. This glorified body is typified by the resurrected Savior IESA and emblemized by the Great Pyramid, which is the symbol of the solar body of man. So Pharaoh is the sensual and double-sexed, male, female, man. There is a play made with some of the names which the Irish myth-makers gave to some of their Egyptian characters, such as Potipharah and Potiphar. The name is from Poti, P-O-T-I, meaning the bowels or belly, and Pher, P-H-E-R, meaning man. But this latter half of the name has the syllable E-H added to it, making it signify truth or wisdom. Hence Potipharah, we find, is the priest of On, the son, the man of truth and wisdom, and the father-in-law of Joseph, who is the striving and upright spirit in man. Potiphar is the lower man, as explained. What Irishman who speaks his language will fail to understand the metaphorical expression 𝗰𝗵𝗵𝗀𝗀. It is a common expression among the Irish to this day, the very idiom used by the ancient Irish mythologists and mystics in veiling their spiritual wisdom from the uninitiated and profane. Potiphar has been enthroned in regular order in the line of Egyptian kings by British writers, and in our own country his standing as a royalty has never been seriously challenged. The same may be said of the writers of all the other so-called enlightened countries. It may seem rather hard to some minds who love fiction to expose him, but it is done only to introduce him in his proper character and place in the drama of human life and the evolution of the spirit in man. In doing this, a real and true revelation and interpretation of truth is given to all earnest and right-thinking men and women whose minds have been perplexed as to the significance or reality of such personages as the pharaohs. Another fictitious personage is King Menes, who is said to have founded the first dynasty in Egypt. The revisionists have here introduced a supposedly Greek word as a name for this mythical king. He is but a phase of our human nature personified, and is introduced in the allegorical story to represent the female Menses. The word mene, M-E-N-E, is derived from the Irish word me, or the Greek word men, and signifies month or monthly. We are told in the story of Egypt that King Menes caused a channel to be dug, leading from the river Nile, causing water to flow under the pyramid. This is but a cryptic allusion to this fact as explained. The river Nile is the blood which circulates through the human body, and is but a secret allusion to this fundamental aspect of man's sexual nature that King Menes represents. Thus he founded the first dynasty in Egypt. The word Nile is Irish and is the genitive of fuil, F-U-I-L, blood. Inflected, the word becomes nuil, N'-U-I-L, hence Nile. Through the splendid imagery of those ancient Irish adepts, poets, and sages, they have given us an allegory which is built upon the natural physical features of Egypt, and also in correspondence with the true aspects of human life. They saw in the great river of Egypt, which gave life and fertility to that country, an analogy to the river of blood circulating through and giving life to the human body. But it required Roman and British clerical writers to circulate the Irish Bible myth as a real and authentic history, which has consistently deceived mankind up to this day. In its ancient perfect form, the Great Pyramid of IESA had an outside covering of white stone and was crowned with a capstone of gold, the sacred metal which was dedicated to the use of the Lord's Son, the Savior, IESA. Chapter 19. Conclusion. In the foregoing pages, I have endeavored to disclose who built the Great Pyramid of IESA, and the purpose for which it was erected, a purpose and a reason which is perhaps as urgent and needful for the moral and spiritual uplift of mankind today as ever before. In the remote past, its message and significance was apprised only by the comparative few. It has been my endeavor to make these most essential truths available to the many who in the present state of enlightenment are ready to receive them. To further this purpose, what nobler project could be the object of an international commission than the restoration of the ancient pillar to its pristine grandeur with its exterior casing of white limestone and its golden capstone reflecting back to heaven its shining rays, bespeaking a perfect union of earth and heaven, and of the perfect man with his Creator. And the pyramid of CHEFREN should also be restored to its former condition, with its white casing and its silver capstone, which symbolizes physically the lesser light of the moon, and spiritually the glory of the imperishable element of the immortal soul. The two other pyramids of the group, with the great Sphinx, should also be put into as good a state of repair as will ensure their preservation, for this fourfold group and Sphinx so perfectly symbolize man that they may again, as in ages past, proclaim their immortal message to all mankind in a manner most unmistakable and impressive. They should not be allowed to perish. This most worthy object would be a common ground upon which the enlightened representatives of all nations could meet in perfect agreement. The lessons of truth to be taught and gleaned from these monuments would do more to bring understanding and brotherhood and peace on earth, goodwill to men, than any movement yet undertaken. It would make it possible to visualize again, as of yore, before the minds of men, a beacon of light in the desert of human life, which would make manifest to the senses and be in consonance with the declaration of the inspired prophet of IESA. Quote, "In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord, and it shall be for a sign and a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt." End quote. Isaiah 19:19-20. Let the restoration of this great altar, sign and witness, and symbolic group be an offering by the nations unto the Lord, that they may be a perpetual reminder and landmark, whose message may serve as an unerring spiritual guidance to all mankind, as bequeathed to us by the great ancient Irish Magian priests of IESA.
So there you have it, folks. I really would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Was this just too out there for you, or is there some merit to this? Just because just because it seems out there, at what point does coincidence or pattern become mathematically impossible, improbable? There's just too many signposts that point in this direction. And when Conor MacDari was writing about this book in 1923, he didn't have access to the type of genetic evidence that we have now. He didn't have access to the DNA record. So I wonder what book he would write today if he had that evidence. Because you can't deny the fact that DNA evidence is also backing up these sorts of claims. You also have evidence of stones like Clochán. You have standing stone circles that are concentrated in Ireland, and as you get closer and closer to Iberia and the UK and all of this, they seem to be getting less and less. I don't know, but it's interesting to think about, right? It's interesting to think about. So until next time, friends, please don't forget to visit my site, brehonacademy.org. That's where you're going to find all of my blog posts going back for years and years. We also have online courses over there. And of course, we have a merch shop. So you're bound to find something that you're interested in over there. Until next time, folks, thanks for watching. I know it's been a marathon. Please share your thoughts below. And for now, slán go fóill.